G'day, mate. 40 here. So counting down, the new biography of Tucker Carlson drops at midnight. I can't wait. It is so good. They had a lengthy excerpt in the New Yorker that I just read, and I want to read some highlights from it. This book. All right. It is so much fun to read. All right. By Jason Zengli. It's called Hated by All the Right People, Tucker Carlson and the Unraveling of the Conservative Mind. In 2019, Carlson devoted an 11-minute monologue to the woes of Sydney, Nebraska, which had once thrived as the headquarters of the sporting goods chain Cabela's. After Cabela merged with Bass Pro Shops, the headquarters was closed, costing a town of 6,000 people more than 2,000 jobs. The merger, Carlson explained, was done at the behest of a hedge fund run by the Republican mega donor and Jewish philanthropist Paul Singer, which had taken an ownership stake in Cabela's and netted nearly $90 million after the merger drove up the retailer's short-term share price. Okay, I think you know where this is going. Jews are absolutely terrified of Tucker Carlson. So this sort of vulture capitalism, Carlson told his viewers, bears no resemblance whatsoever to the capitalism we were promised in school. It creates nothing. It destroys entire cities. It couldn't be uglier or more destructive. So why is it allowed in the United States? The short answer, because people like Paul Singer have tremendous influence over our political process. And your first reaction is, well, what would Mike Enoch think about this? So Mike Enoch, on his podcast, The Daily Shower, called out Tucker Carlson's remarks. He said that Carlson had begun the segment by describing how the notoriously anti-Semitic Henry Ford once raised the wages of his workers. If you didn't catch the German Shepherd whistles, where he praised Henry Ford and then went into a diatribe of a Jewish financier, Enoch said approvingly, I don't know what universe you're existing in. So who was responsible for many of the words coming out of Tucker Carlson's mouth? They were largely the responsibility of Blake Neff, the longtime head writer at Tucker Carlson Tonight. And he boasted to Dartmouth Alumni Magazine, anything Tucker's reading off the teleprompter, the first draft was written by me. The anti-immigrant and racist sentiments that dominated the show came naturally to Neff at the time that Neff was writing for Carlson, first as a reporter at the Daily Caller, and then as a staffer on Tucker Carlson Tonight. He was also writing posts on a racist and sexist message board called Auto Admit. Never been on that board. Posting under the username Charles the 12th, the 18th century Swedish warrior king, who later became an icon for Swedish neo-Nazis, Neff joked about foodie F-words and proposed an urban business idea. He didn't do muffin, which would sell Sandra Bland's sugar-free shortbreads, reference to the 28-year-old black woman who in 2015 was taken into custody by a Texas state trooper after a traffic stop and was later found dead in a jail cell, becoming an early symbol of the Black Lives Matter movement. An analysis of the neo-Nazi website, The Daily Stormer, found that between November 2016 and November 2018, Tucker Carlson was mentioned in 265 of its articles, most of them featuring clips of his show with titles like Tucker Fills Liberal K-Word with Lead for Demanding Gun Control and Tucker Carlson Forces Fat Beano Whore to Choke to Death on Greasy Tacos. Oof. Hannity, by comparison, was the subject of just 27 Daily Stormer articles during that period. Laura Ingraham, another of Fox's primetime hosts, was the subject of just 4. As one blog post at the Daily Stormer Accelerator, Tucker Carlson is basically Daily Stormer the show. Other than the language used, he is covering all our talking points. Whoa, did we just have an earthquake? I felt like we just had an earthquake. So I'm a big fan of David Pinsof and his alliance theory of political belief systems.
So starting with the fun stuff, let's talk about political belief systems then. So, I mean, I guess that if you talk with political scientists and philosophers when it comes to explaining how political belief systems work, where they come from, they would give you a highly intellectualized version of it based on abstract values and how they are so coherent and so on. But since you come from an evolutionary psychology perspective, how do you approach it exactly?
Yeah, so I have a kind of
A
cheeky
highly
blog called Everything is Bullshit, and part of the shtick there is to call bullshit on things. And you could describe my academic paper, Strange Bedfellows, The Alliance Theory of Political Belief Systems, as a way of calling bullshit on that prevailing view of political ideology. So I really take aim at the idea that liberalism or conservatism, as they manifest in contemporary American society or other Western nations, represent coherent belief systems, reflect moral principles, reflect well thought out philosophies. I think they are much more strategic, chaotic, random than that. And I'd be happy to get into the details of how I'm grounding out that view.
Okay, so, but just before we get into your view and start exploring it, what would you say are some of the most common explanations that people bring to the table when trying to explain where political belief systems come from?
Yeah, so I'd say, broadly speaking, the most common approach to political belief systems is to point to some essential difference between people on either side of the political spectrum. So maybe that essential difference has to do with one's personality or one's psychological dispositions, one's traits, one's personal idiosyncrasies and quirks, the way one sees the world. Um, and that's one common way of looking at it. The other way of looking at it is to say that they really pertain to differences in moral values. So one of the most prominent approaches in this area is Jonathan Haidt's moral foundations theory, which says that liberals and conservatives rely on different moral foundations. That is, liberals have a monomaniacally egalitarian and harm-focused ideology, whereas conservatives rely on all six moral foundations, from in-group, out-group psychology to purity and authority. And roughly, I think a lot of people in political psychology would agree that there are deep-seated moral differences between liberals and conservatives, Republicans and Democrats, left-wing, right-wing, etc. And it's those abstract moral values that.
So counting down just 10 hours and 20 minutes until this new Jason Zangali book drops. I emailed him for an interview, but I fear that I'm too low status. I'm in the wrong tribe. I don't think he's going to grant me with an interview, but you'll be glad to know he did give one to Jewish Insider. So I'll talk to you about that. Anyway, so how would Tucker Carlson and alliance theory fit together? So I asked ChatGPT to put this together, and it says alliance theory would read this not as Tucker is a secret Nazi and not as Tucker is innocent but misread, but this is a case study in how rival coalitions try to recruit, reframe, and annex a high status voice when alliance maps are redrawn. So we have three layers operating at once. So why does the Daily Stormer latch onto Tucker? So extremist sub-alliances are always hunting for bridge nodes into mainstream legitimacy. They do not need ideological purity. They need shared enemies, shared grievance language, shared status resentment, shared stories of betrayal by elites. So Tucker's core narrative after 2016 was global finance hollows out nations, cosmopolitan elites sacrifice local communities, the managerial class lies about immigration and culture, ordinary people are being dispossessed. So these are not Nazi doctrines. These are populist ones. But alliance theory predicts that any movement that frames power as hidden, transnational, elite, coordinated, morally corrupt, and responsible for national decline will attract attempts at symbolic capture by radical or conspiratorial factions who already believe in a shadowy elite story and are constantly trying to launder their worldview through respectable voices. So the Stormer is saying, this is our show. It's not proof of Tucker's intent. It is proof of a parasitic transitivity, a fringe coalition trying to root its own narrative through a far more powerful node. So they are saying, he names the same enemies we do, therefore he is one of us. So this is alliance appropriation. It's not alliance membership. The Paul Singer segment and dog whistle interpretation. So from an alliance theory perspective, the key move is not Jewish billionaire, but financial elite personalization. So populist movements need villains with faces. hedge funds, private equity, corporate raiders, shareholder primacy, short-termism, deindustrialization. So naming a specific financier is a classic populist narrative move. So when you have a minority group that is overrepresented in elite finance, a mass movement mobilized against elite finance and historical memory, including conspiracy traditions, then rival coalitions will automatically attempt to racialize the critique, whether or not Tucker intends that. So the extremist reaction, he praised Henry Ford, then he attacked a Jew. This is an attempt to recode a class critique as a racial and ethnic critique, pull Tucker's audience into a different rival map, and transform elites versus the people into Jews versus nation. So this is classic coalition capture maneuver. They're not discovering hidden Nazi signals coming from Tucker. They're trying to create a transitivity between Tucker's populist audience and their own racial frame. As for Blake Neff, alliance theory says large coalitions always contain sub-factions with much darker rival maps than the public face of the movement. So Blake Neff's presence illustrates how a mainstream populist media operation can unknowingly employ people whose private alliance identity is more radical. Then message production pipelines can be infiltrated by actors who see themselves as advancing a deeper and darker cause, and boundary enforcement fails when a movement grows faster than its screening capacity. That doesn't mean the movement's public leader shares that inner ideology. It means rapidly expanding alliances attract opportunist ideologues and infiltrators. Some see the mass coalition as a vehicle for their own more extreme project. They hide behind shared surface enemies while diverging at the level of ultimate explanation. So Blake Neff was not the truth behind Tucker. He was an example of latent factional drift inside a rising coalition. So you see the collision of three alliances here. You have a populist realignment, a mass movement redefining its enemies as financial, bureaucratic, and cultural elites. You have extremist parasitism. You have these small racialized coalitions trying to graft themselves onto that narrative by reframing elite as Jewish and globalist as ethnic and Jewish. Then you have elite counterframing. So establishment institutions attempt to discredit the populist leader, the Tucker Carlsons, by highlighting the worst actors who try to attach themselves to him. So none of this requires secret signaling or coded intent. It arises automatically when a dominant coalition fractures, a new mass alliance forms, enemy maps shift, and taboo boundaries weaken. Now, Jewish conservatives sense the danger, not because Tucker is a Nazi, but because when a movement organizes around hidden power, elite betrayal, foreign influence, institutional coordination, and national decline, there's always a risk that some faction will try to Judaize the enemy. And minority groups know that when the elite quietly morphs into that group or Jews, right, things get dangerous fast. So the Daily Stormer celebration of Tucker tells us nothing about Tucker's intent. It tells us that extremist alliances behave when they see a mass movement cracking open elite legitimacy. They then try to ride it, reframe it, racialize it, claim it, and steer it. And then the question becomes, will the larger coalition resist that capture?
Color and explain the contents of our political belief systems. They are the common thread that ties all our beliefs together, and I think that is mistaken.
And what would you say are some of the biggest weaknesses, at least in your view, when it comes to hypotheses that are based on or try to explain political belief systems on the basis of abstract values? Because, I mean, it seems to me that sometimes...
So let's talk about this title of the new book, Hated by All the Right People, Tucker Carlson and the Unraveling of the Conservative Mind. I can read your mind right now. You're saying, 40, what does alliance theory have to say about this title? And I'm glad you asked, because alliance theory would say the title is doing coalition work more than descriptive work. So hated by all the right people is a status signal. Tells the reader which alliance the author belongs to and which alliance he wants to flatter. So the people who hate Tucker are the morally legitimate elite. Being hated by them proves Tucker's corruption, and I, the author, stand with the elites. So the title performs three functions. It certifies the in-group. The right people are journalists and members of the elite, national security professionals, liberal academics, mainstream conservatives, institutional gatekeepers, right? So you know when you get this book, you can feel reassured that this book is speaking from inside that prestige network. It's not a bunch of grubby people creating this book. It's a prestige network. And Tucker is not just a critic of the elites. He is a defector. He's not controversial. He's not wrong. He's unraveling. Guys, we have psychological and moral collapse. It's not just ideological disagreement. You don't argue with defectors, you pathologize them. They're bad, they're sick. And the third function served by this title, it preemptively defines the rival map. So if Tucker is hated by the right people, then anyone who sympathizes with Tucker is the wrong people. So the book, with its title, is a boundary policing device. It's not just a biography, right? The title is not neutral. It's not a descriptor. It is a loyalty marker. So my fellow patriots, my fellow members of the elite, you can be reassured that you are still the moral center of the universe, that your hatred is evidence of your virtue, and that any kind of defection into populism is a mental breakdown. And you can trust that the old conservative institutional alliances, such as National Review, they are who define sanity and legitimacy. So the title is not so much about Tucker. The title is about who gets to decide which hatreds count as honorable. And if you hate Tucker, this title should reassure you that that hatred is honorable.
People are trying to talk about abstract values and not necessarily just moral values, but some other sorts of political values, as if they were like sort of separate from the rest of our psychology and based on just...
So Jewish conservatives are terrified of Tucker Carlson, is what the author of this new book, Jason Zangli, tells Jewish Insider. So someone close to Tucker says that his turn against Israel, when he concluded that all the people who were opposed to Tucker, to him, and to Trump after 2016 were big Israel supporters. So Tucker's like, all right, I'm just going to tick these people off by going after Israel. And that's where it started. And Bill Kristol looms large in the Tucker Carlson story. So Tucker used to be close to Bill Kristol. He was a protege of Bill Kristol, right? And the story that Tucker tells is that he was a young, naive, innocent writer. He just basically got into intellectual and ideological neoconservative bed with Bill Kristol and John Podhoretz and company. And he just innocently slipped into supporting all these crazy overseas war. It was like the invasion and occupation of Afghanistan and Iraq. And he just naively supported free trade deals and doing all these things that hurt the white working class in America. And now Tucker realizes that he was wrong then, and he is doing penance. But the author says that's not the true story. So why is William Kristol such a huge figure in Tucker's mythology? So he used to be close to Kristol. He used to look up to Kristol. Kristol was his first boss, had a big impact on Tucker's career. Now Tucker sees it all bad. And so now Tucker is talking about how Bill Kristol hates Christians, right? And this is the Bill Kristol who hired Fred Barnes, evangelical Christian, took vacations with Gary Bauer, leading American Christian. But Tucker has recast all this. So Trump and Vance have so far refrained from explicitly distancing themselves from Tucker. And so Jason Zengli says, certain Jewish conservatives feel like as long as Trump is there, everything's going to be fine. They view Tucker as a bad influence on Vance. And if they can just get rid of that bad influence, then J.D. Vance will be okay. But they're really terrified of Tucker. They're really terrified of what comes after Trump. And they're terrified that Tucker will have a major influence on whatever comes after Trump, because Tucker has an even more loyal following than does Trump. And Jewish conservatives worry about the influence that Tucker has on J.D. Vance. They want to believe that J.D. Vance will be okay. It's just left to his own devices, but they think Tucker is leading J.D. in a bad direction. Therefore, they need to take out Tucker. It goes beyond Israel. It's a genuine fear. What would it mean to be Jewish in the United States under a President Tucker Carlson? And I know what you're thinking, 40. What does alliance theory have to say about this? Alliance theory would say that this terror that Jewish conservatives feel about Tucker, it's not irrational or hysterical. It is structurally understandable. So two alliances are colliding. You've got first Tucker's role shift. He's moved from mainstream conservative media node inside the pro-Israel neocon GOP alliance to being the chief identity voice of a post-liberal, populist, anti-establishment coalition. And that coalition defines its main enemies as the permanent national security state, foreign policy elites, NGOs and international lobbies, prestige media, and globalist influence networks. So Israel used to be a sacred ally inside the old conservative coalition. In the new populist coalition, Israel is increasingly treated as part of the same elite foreign policy consensus that brought us disaster in Iraq, Afghanistan, Ukraine, and all these endless, pointless interventions. So Jewish conservatives built their status, their safety, and their identity inside this old alliance map. Now suddenly they see one of the movement's most powerful voices reclassifying a core pillar of their world as part of the enemy. So this is destabilizing. So now the pro-Israel elites are Tucker's enemy. So Tucker turns against Israel when he notices that many of his fiercest critics and Trump's fiercest critics are fiercely pro-Israel. So we build our political maps not on the basis of abstract moral reasoning. We build them on the basis of pattern recognition in social conflict. Are you one of those bad people who notices patterns in the world? You shouldn't do that. So who attacks me? Who defends me? Who defends the institutions I attack? Who shares enemies with me? Who shares allies with me? So if the most powerful people call you dangerous, racist, authoritarian, or a threat to democracy, and these people are clustered in the legacy media, foreign policy establishment, neoconservative circles, liberal Zionist networks, national security bureaucracy, then your brain's alliance system begins to merge all these nodes into a single hostile block. And the logic becomes, these people coordinated against me. They all defend the same institutional order. They all justify the same wars and the same censorship. They all treat me and my movement as illegitimate. So then Israel is no longer primarily just the Jewish homeland. Israel becomes symbolically fused with the elite foreign policy alliance that the populist coalition defines as the main enemy. Right? This isn't requiring any anti-Semitism here. It just requires alliance reclassification. Now, why do Jewish conservatives feel especially exposed? Because they sit at a dangerous intersection. They are inside the populist right. They are emotionally and civilizationally and tribally tied to Israel. They are historically sensitive to any elite scapegoating. So when the dominant voices of the populist coalition start saying, the foreign policy establishment lies, the security state manipulates, the post-war consensus is corrupt, powerful foreign lobbies distort debate, and then Israel begins to be rhetorically grouped with that enemy system, Jewish conservatives see a classic risk pattern. They see a coalition defining itself against hidden power, against elite rule, against a moralized native. They see a moralized narrative of betrayal. They see a search for coordinating agents behind the scenes. They see a populist movement that increasingly distrusts mediating institutions. So minorities embedded in mass movements always fear being reclassified from ally to questionable to enemy. It's not because Tucker necessarily intends persecution, but alliance narratives, once they harden, quickly slide from this institution is powerful to this group is responsible. So are the fears of Jewish conservatives valid? Yes, in a structural sense. Not in the sense that Tucker is secretly planning a Holocaust, but in the sense that when a movement redraws its rival map around global elites, foreign influence, security state manipulation, censorship networks, transnational lobbies, any group strongly associated, fairly or unfairly, with one of those nodes becomes anxious. So this is rational alliance risk assessment. It's not paranoia. So if the populist right continues to define itself primarily against the national security consensus, interventionism, global institutional power, elite moral policing, then Jewish conservatives will face increasing tension between their place in populism, their attachment to Israel, their sensitivity to historical scapegoating. So some Jewish conservatives will try to act as bridges. Some will quietly withdraw. Some will over-signal their loyalty to the populist coalition, and some will be pushed out. Not because of hatred and bigotry and racism and anti-Semitism, right, but because alliance maps are redrawn and old sacred cows losing protected status. Now old sacred cows getting sacrificed.
Pure rational philosophy or something like that. So what are your thoughts on that?
Sure, yeah. I think the biggest problem with that view is that it's just fundamentally evolutionarily implausible. So if you actually look at what people who believe in these abstract values are saying, usually what they're saying is that these values are not self-interested. They're not helping a person advance their power or status or access to resources. They're not in the interests of one's self or one's kin. But they're also not group interested either, because if they were, then we would strategically endorse whatever values support our political allies, and reject them or flout them when they serve the interests of our political rivals. And when we have a wide variety of heterogeneous political allies, as we do in modern democracies with complex political coalitions, then we're going to see the strategic endorsement of moral values in one case to support one's allies, and the rejection of that moral value when it happens to support our rivals. And so that is basically identical to alliance theory, is that these values are not really held consistently, but are used strategically to support the interests of one's allies and oppose the interests of one's rivals. But the problem is, if these abstract values are not in our self-interest, and they're not in our political allies' interests or our group's interests, then that really rules out the only possible mechanisms by which these values could have evolved. Darwin once famously said that.
So what will life be like for Jews under a President Tucker Carlson? So alliance theory says it won't be a repeat of the 1930s, but it will be a period of alliance anxiety, not pogroms. So the stress will be primarily symbolic, institutional, and psychological more than physical. So Jews would no longer be part of the default moral elite coalition. So for the last 70 years, American Jews have been unusually well-positioned, disproportionately well-positioned, according to the Nathan Cofnas default hypothesis, because they live in dominantly urban areas and they got high average IQs. So for the last 70 years, Jews have been disproportionately well-positioned inside media, academia, law, NGOs, foreign policy, civil rights institutions. Now, these institutions would all lose status and influence under a Tucker Carlson presidency. So the moral center of gravity in America would shift from a cosmopolitan liberal center dominated by Jews to a populist nationalist center that would tend to be more Jew skeptical. So Jews would feel what many WASP liberals felt under Trump, not persecution, but loss of narrative centrality. So their language, their priorities, their historical memory would no longer automatically define what counts as moral seriousness. So Israel would lose sacred cow status. Israel would be treated as one nation among many. Israel would be treated as a strategic partner, not a moral lodestar. Israel would be as subject to criticism as any other nation, and Israel would become associated with the old security elite. So this would be emotionally destabilizing for Jews who built an American Jewish identity around Israel's special moral protection. So the alliance guarantee would feel weaker. Extremist factions would try to attach themselves. So white nationalist sub-alliances would attempt symbolic capture. They'd claim Tucker as one of us. They'd try to racialize his anti-elite rhetoric. He would reject them explicitly, but their presence would increase this ambient unease. So the danger here would not be state-sponsored anti-Semitism. It would be fringe parasitism on a mass populist movement. Now, Jewish conservatives could become crucial bridge figures, right? Jews inside the populist coalition might gain influence as translators and validators. They would work to keep the populist movement de-racialized. They would try to block scapegoating of Jews. They try to reassure Israel hawks. They try to maintain civilizational framing rather than ethnic framing. They'd also feel pressure, suspicion, and constant loyalty testing. Are you America first? Are you Israel first? Jewish liberals would feel culturally exiled. They wouldn't be legally threatened, but they would experience loss of institutional comfort. They would lose status. Their moral language would no longer command deference. They would be talked about rather than spoken with, and they'd be associated with the old regime, which is the enemy. So they would experience elite displacement more than minority persecution. So Jewish security consciousness would rise, not because of state policy, but because online radicalism would feel closer and more dangerous. Alliance rhetoric about elites would stir unease, and historical memory would sharpen threat sensitivity. So there'd be more Jewish private security, more community coordination, more vigilance, not necessarily more mass fear. The real tension would be over narrative, not physical safety. So the deepest shift would be this. Jews would no longer be the canonical symbol of historical victimhood in American moral discourse. Jews would become one group among many in an American nationalist story about civilizational survival, sovereignty, and elite betrayal. So Tucker Carlson presidency would not make Jews physically unsafe. It'd make Jews psychologically uneasy. It would make their place in the elite structure uncertain. Jews would have to diversify political alliances. They'd have to strengthen ties to the state rather than to elite NGOs. They'd have to rely less on moral deference. They'd have to rely more on their embeddedness in institutions. They'd they'd have to accept that some of their sacred narratives would lose protected status, and Jews would become more subject to criticism like other groups. So the danger would not be pogroms, the danger would be misclassification into the enemy map. And Jews tend to be exquisitely sensitive to when a society's enemy map starts to blur and possibly include them.
Something along the lines of things don't exist merely for the sake of beauty or for the sake of mere variety. They don't exist to delight man or the creator, right? And if you could show that the properties of an animal exhibited these benevolent properties, then that would be absolutely fatal to the theory of evolution. And I think a lot of people in political psychology are taking that kind of evolutionarily implausible view that we have these high-minded values that are nobly designed to make the world a better place. But that's just not the kind of thing that can evolve by natural selection. And so I think we actually need to get a bit more cynical about our supposed moral values in the same way that we're cynical about the mission statements and PR campaigns of big corporations. I don't think anyone thinks that Starbucks' actual goal is to nourish and inspire the human spirit, as it says on their website. I think most people, when trying to predict what Starbucks is going to do next, are going to ask themselves what will make Starbucks the most money. And I think we.
So there were two dissident right Jews who destabilized and neutralized the alt-right. Nathan Cofnas, with his default hypothesis that Jewish disproportionate success in certain fields is due to high average Jewish IQs and the Jews disproportionately live in urban areas. Then Mike Benz said to the alt-right, the enemy is not the Jews, the enemy is this globalist hostile elite. So how do we account for the rise of Mike Benz from Frame Game Radio 2018 to where he is today? Right. So Mike Benz mapped the purported hidden alliance structure of power, and he named it. So during the first Trump presidency, the right felt it was being constrained by all these institutions it could not control: tech platforms, NGOs, intelligence-linked networks, universities, election monitoring groups, civil society coalitions, State Department adjacent organizations. So the right felt the pressure, but they lacked a coherent enemy map. Mike Benz supplied the enemy map. He translated all these diffuse grievances into a concrete alliance story and map. He mapped who coordinates with whom, which NGOs link to which agencies, how censorship, funding, foreign policy, narrative control interlock, how civil society functions as a regime maintenance layer. So alliance theory says movements need three things to consolidate: a shared enemy, story of how power works, and a narrator makes the story feel intelligible and actionable. So Benz became that narrator. So he came from inside the State Department. That gave him credibility as a defector, not just a critic. He had a background as a corporate lawyer. He had an elite education. He was able to speak the language of institutions, process, networks, interagency coordination, information warfare. So he was able to translate populist anger into elite level structural explanation. He became the bridge between the populist right and the bureaucratic deep structure it distrusted. So before Trump, the Conservative Alliance still trusted institutions. After Trump, large parts of the right reclassified these institutions as hostile. So that creates a demand for deep state cartography, right? Draw the maps, how the deep state works. Created a demand for censorship, infrastructure analysis, NGO state tech alliance mapping, information control genealogy. So Mike Benz rose when the right-wing populist coalition needed a guide to a newly discovered enemy terrain. So his role was not that of the demagogue primarily, or a culture warrior, or a policy wonk. He was an alliance cartographer and legitimacy stripper. And he told his audience, here is how the enemy regime coordinates. Here's why you keep losing. Here's why elections alone are not enough. Here's how narrative and NGO power constrains our sovereignty. So people like Mike Benz either become institutionalized as core strategists if the populist coalition gains power and needs internal theorists, or they get marginalized and attacked if their mapping threatens too many powerful interests inside and outside the movement. So Mike Benz's rise is not about charisma, it's about structural necessity. He performs a function the post-liberal, post-trust right needs. Someone who can explain the invisible alliance machinery that governs speech, legitimacy, and power. Now, does he need to get his facts right? Does he need to be accurate? Not so much. He just needs to give a story that is appealing, that it needs to meet needs. His power comes from his ability to draw maps of the enemy and make it seem convincing. So when he claims to map hidden coordination networks between the government, NGOs, tech platforms, media, foreign policy institutions, his audience is not mainly asking, is this factually correct? Right? They're asking, does this map kind of make sense? Does it feel right for why we keep losing and who is aligned with who? So Mike Benz has plausibility, right? He gives lots of details. He presents documents. He seems institutionally literate. It feels real. Then his rival map, his enemy map, coheres, right? He produces a stable and emotionally satisfying ally-enemy structure. And it really doesn't matter if he doesn't get all his facts right. And he is morally and strategically useful, right? He helps people, and he helps the right understand itself as constrained by a coordinated enemy regime, not just unlucky or incompetent. So his accuracy, his factuality is filtered through this question. Does this Mike Benz presentation help my side see the battlefield more clearly and rally on behalf of my side? So most people on the populist right who follow Mike Benz would say yes. So Mike Benz uses truth in an instrumental fashion. He can't be seen as fabricating. Right? He needs to seem reliable. Right? He has to be accurate enough to be trusted as an insider, but his power comes from organizing facts into a narrative that stabilizes the identity of his side and clarifies the enemy's. So his authority does not rest on facts, whether every document proves what he says. It rests on his overall picture of power. Does it feel true? Does it feel right? Does it help his audience coordinate their emotions, their morality, their strategy against the enemy that they feel is hostile? So truth matters, but alliance use is more important, right? The needs of the alliance determine which truths are central and which are ignored. Now, René DiResta has made many devastating critiques of Mike Benz's claims, and his critics point out factual correction after factual correction after factual correction, and yet Mike Benz only seems to get stronger. And this is exactly what you would expect when influence is rooted in your service to the coalition and providing a narrative that meets their needs, rather than as based in neutral fact-checking. So his authority does not primarily come from being the most accurate analyst of documents. It comes from playing a role for the populist coalition. He maps the enemy, and he gives people a coherent story about the enemy and about why the enemy is diminishing the quality of their life and why the enemy is organizing and coordinating against them. Now, critics issue factual correction after factual correction, and things happen. Who is providing the correction? When it's the enemy who's correcting, then Mike Benz's audience isn't going to take them seriously. Then often the critics operate at a micro level with timelines and program names and funding and organization. But Mike Benz is operating at the macro level. He is mapping powerful institutions aligned in ways that try to constrain dissent and shape narratives. So you can win many micro disputes and still fail to dislodge the macro narrative. So Mike Benz's audience might hear a factual correction or two and think, okay, maybe Mike misread this memo, but the overall picture of the enemy still fits what I experience. And all these factual corrections increase perceived threat sensitivity. So when a high-status defender of the enemy devotes sustained energy to rebutting Mike Benz, signals that Mike Benz is important. He's talking about things that are important. So attention from a powerful enemy increases in-group loyalty to the challenged figure, Mike Benz. Also, there's reputational asymmetry. Mike Benz's audience does not love him based on his error rate metric used in journalism and academia. They evaluate him on, does he name the correct enemies? Does he explain why our side keeps losing institutional fights? Does his story feel true? Does it feel more true than the official story? Does he speak the language of power from the inside? So as long as Mike Benz is meeting those needs in his audience, all these technical corrections do not diminish his value. They even reinforce his value because they dramatize conflict between rival coalitions.
the other issues that we watch play out. We have some record cold air that's going to come moving in over the next couple of days. And that beyond that, we are going to be watching for an opportunity of these cold temperatures to continue to take shape as we head into the middle of the week. So diving going through the weekend, we continue with those.
And some of his agents are going to leave Minneapolis as soon as tomorrow. This is Tom Homan makes his way to the state. That was the president earlier today. Telling everybody that he was going to send Tom Homan there. Also, President Trump had a phone call today with Minnesota Governor Tim Walz, calling on the governor to hand over all the criminal illegal aliens. But Walz claims his state honors all immigration detainers. Here's Caroline Levitt. She was in the briefing room earlier today.
This tragedy occurred as a result of a deliberate and hostile resistance by Democrat leaders in Minnesota. Governor Walz and Mayor Frey have shamefully blocked local and state police from cooperating with ICE, actively inhibiting efforts to arrest violent criminals. They have also used their platforms to encourage left-wing agitators to stalk, record, confront, and obstruct federal officers who were just trying to lawfully perform their duties. This is precisely what unfolded in Minneapolis on Saturday morning. Obstructing federal law enforcement and inciting violence against officers is wrong and illegal.
Just yesterday, Governor Walz compared immigration enforcement in Minnesota to the Holocaust.
We have got children in Minnesota hiding in their houses, afraid to go outside. Many of us grew up reading that story of Anne Frank. Somebody's going to write that children's story about Minnesota.
Okay, so a little hyperbole there. Tomorrow is actually Holocaust Remembrance Day, so who knows what he'll come up with by then. But, Jesse, the president also put out a Truth Social statement saying that they had a good call and that they have some sort of...
So Renee DiResta, I think, is pretty sharp in her factual corrections of Mike Benz. And so she is defending institutions such as universities and NGOs and an elite who wants to restrict speech. So I find that when Renee DiResta goes up against Mike Benz, Renee DiResta is factually correct virtually every time of which I'm aware. So she'll come on and she'll point out Mike Benz's misinterpretations, overgeneralizations, incorrect timelines, conflations of programs, misread documents. And she acts as a boundary guardian for the existing elite alliance. Right? She'll say, this is not how our system works. These institutions are not coordinated the way you claim. These inferences are irresponsible. And her corrections are usually factually valid. But factual correction does not change people's political views. It does not dissolve the friend-enemy distinction. So if the audience has already reclassified institutions as hostile, then her technical corrections on behalf of those institutions is processed by Mike Benz viewers as damage control, narrative defense, regime self-exculpation. So even when she's accurate, she doesn't collapse the deeper belief that a coordinated elite system exists and it is constraining us. So her corrections land as, you're wrong about this detail, but her corrections are heard as, they are trying to protect themselves. And her corrections even strengthen Mike Benz's status, because she is a high-status defender of the system. She's investing energy in rebutting Mike Benz. It signals that Mike Benz is hitting something sensitive and important. Why are they so nervous if nothing is there? So her rebuttals raise Mike Benz's perceived importance even when her rebuttals are factually strong. So the real battlefield here is narrative coherence, not facts. Mike Benz's influence depends on whether his story provides a coherent explanation of power, a sense of hidden coordination on the part of enemies, a moral framing of betrayal and control, a map that fits people's lived experience. So Renee DiResta can disprove 10 Mike Benz claims, but the audience still feels censored, marginalized, delegitimized, locked out of institutions. So Mike Benz's larger narrative remains intact. The map still works emotionally and socially. So factual corrections would only bite Mike Benz when they come from defectors of his camp, not incumbents, when they destroy his map of the enemy, not just details, when they show internal contradictions that break the coalition behind Mike Benz, when they demonstrate the supposed coordination is actually fragmentation, or when the correction offers a better, more satisfying explanation and narrative story of power. So perhaps a former insider on Mike Benz's own side, someone who shares his audience's identity, that person can do more damage with one calm contradiction than 100 institutional fact checks. So Renee DiResta is winning the factual skirmishes. Mike Benz is winning the alliance war. because this contest is not primarily over what is true. Contest is over which coalition gets to define who is trustworthy, who is coordinating, who is lying, who is protecting whom, and what is the real structure of power. Now, how to understand the shift from Mike Benz's frame game radio on the alt-right in 2018 to Mike Benz, right? How did he move from being a niche analyst inside a small epistemic sub-alliance to becoming a personal alliance hub for a larger Republican coalition? So as frame game radio, Mike Benz was operating on a boutique insider platform. He had a small audience, highly online, an audience already hostile to mainstream institutions. His role there was technical. He mapped narratives, NGOs, programs, information flows for people who shared his enemy map. He was a specialist serving in an existing micro-coalition. Then he becomes the brand, the focal point, and the loyalty anchor when he stops being a commentator and becomes a coordination node. So he shifted from explanation to identity. So as frame game radio, he explained how power works. As Mike Benz, he embodied power. Right? He offered a place where his audience could go to feel aligned, validated, and oriented against a common enemy. So by breaking out under his real name, he made himself easier to connect with and to root through. So podcasts, interviews, X, Substack, YouTube, donor networks, political figures, Mike Benz becomes a bridge between populist audiences, tech right circles, foreign policy dissidents, institutional defectors. So this raises his structural value. He's now an ex-State Department figure. So he moves from technical cartographer to movement intellectual. So frame game radio is primarily about frames. Mike Benz is primarily about the regime, the enemy regime, and how censorship, NGOs, intelligence, diplomacy, and civil society form a single coordinated system that holds you down. So this is a narrative that the large populist coalition needs to see itself as a unified counter-alliance rather than just a collection of grievances. So the rebranding matters. Alliance theory says names signal role. Frame games radio sounds like a tool. Mike Benz is a leader. Not a politician, not a demagogue, but a theorist of the coalition's enemy structure, someone whose personal credibility, biography, and defection story become part of the alliance's self-understanding. So he moves from an analyst inside a dissident niche to alliance cartographer for a broad populist coalition to an institutional intellectual of the post-liberal right. So his platform keeps growing even as his critics pick apart his claims. His function is not primarily to be right about each document. His function is to give a rising populist coalition a coherent picture of the enemy and how the enemy operates.
We need to view humans in a similar way. I think we need to view the quote-unquote mission statements of political design to mobilize supporters. We really have no reason to think that they represent nobly designed, impartially altruistic worldviews. I think that's fundamentally, evolutionarily, and functionally implausible.
And a very interesting question here is if people's political beliefs are even consistent. That is, and of course that might mean different things, but I guess that what people mean by consistent here is that, for example, if someone says they are from the left or from the right, or a Republican, a Democrat, a Libertarian, an authoritarian, or something like that, there's sort of a checklist, and they check all the points when it comes to the political beliefs that you usually associate with either side of the political spectrum. But I mean, there are, I guess, very...
The answer is no, right? Politics isn't about moral and philosophical consistency. It's about building a coalition that's strong and broad enough to seize power. So what is the New York Times business model from the perspective of alliance theory? The New York Times is not mainly selling news and information. It is selling elite alliance coordination. Its real product is not news. It is legitimacy, moral framing, status signaling, rival mapping, boundary enforcement. Who does the Times serve? Right? Not just readers. The Times serves the professional class, the elite, the managers, the academics, NGO staff, policy elites, cultural institutions, globalist business networks. This elite needs a shared narrative about who is respectable, who is dangerous, what counts as science, what counts as democracy, what counts as hate, what is extremism, and what policies are beyond debate. So the New York Times is the priesthood that certifies these judgments. Its business model is based on selling subscriptions. People pay to belong to the moral elite. If you read the New York Times, it signals I am a good person, I am educated, I am decent, and I am on the right side of history. It is a status badge. You get narrative synchronization for institutions. Universities, corporations, NGOs, foundations, courts, and bureaucracies need a common moral language. The New York Times supplies it every day. This reduces coordination costs among the elite alliances. The New York Times provides boundary policing. The New York Times tells its coalition which questions are legitimate, which questions are dangerous, which people are fringe, which views are misinformation, which findings are harmful, which speech must be constrained. So this keeps the left-wing alliance morally coherent. The New York Times agenda is setting the agenda, not finding facts. The New York Times decide what must be talked about, what must not be talked about. Silence is as important as coverage. New York Times provides reputational laundering. It provides coverage to justify the actions of institutions. If the New York Times frames something as necessary, ethical, or inevitable, elites can act with moral cover. Why is the New York Times hostile to certain types of science? Because certain empirical scientific findings threaten DEI regimes, policy legitimacy, moral narratives, funding structures, professional status hierarchies. So the New York Times does not evaluate these empirical findings as hypotheses. It evaluates them as threats to alliance stability. So you get the language: dangerous, misuse, stigmatizing, extremist, adjacent, undermines trust. So these are not scientific categories. These are alliance defense categories. Now, why do New York Times readers tolerate so much bad reporting on taboo topics? Because the value of the New York Times is not in truth and accuracy. The value comes from reassurance. New York Times tells its audience, your worldview is correct, your moral instincts are noble, your enemies are wicked, your status is deserved, your power is legitimate. Right? This is the emotional identity service that people pay for. The New York Times is a legitimacy factory, a moral court, a status certification authority, a rival map, enemy map distributor, and a taboo enforcement agency. It's not about discovering the truth. It is about maintaining a coalition. This business model works because the elites will always pay to be told that they are good people, their power is justified, and dangerous truths are not really truths at all.
Very good criticisms of that. For example, back in 2018, I interviewed Robert Kurzban, and he has a very good book about that, and he sort of shows, I think, to some extent that people are not really consistent, at least if we look at things from expecting that people, again, check all of the boxes when it comes to a particular political ideology. And there are things that perhaps, even if I, for example, identify...
Man, this guy's questions are way too long. All right, let's go to the chat. Bob says, Jews are afraid of Christian nationalist J.D. Vance and his Hindu wife. Both Mike Enoch and the Daily Stormer get a mention in the new book. Eric Stryker, maybe not so much. He'll be sore. Peter Brimlow compared Stephen Miller to Benjamin Disraeli on his Tucker Carlson interview. Disraeli, of Jewish background, converted to Christianity and created a conservative alliance in British politics that lasted for generations. Brimlow also predicted that Stephen Miller will be the first Jewish president of America. Does Tucker Carlson have managerial and political acumen? From the river to the sea, occupied England must be free. Bob says, I read Patrick Cockburn's biography of al-Sadr today, the leader of the Shia insurgency in Iraq after the American invasion. It's about how the Shia clerics survived the Saddam regime, struggled to manage a fragile alliance after the American invasion. You should ask ChatGPT, how does this biography, how would this biography be improved by a clearer understanding of alliance theory? Muqtada al-Sadr, what a guy. Muqtada al-Sadr's father, brothers, and father-in-law were all killed by Saddam, but Muqtada survived by playing dumb. So I wonder what alliance theory would have to say about the career trajectory of Muqtada al-Sadr.
As a Republican, I might agree with some points, on some points with the Democrats and vice versa. So are people's political beliefs really consistent or not?
Yeah, so it's a complicated question in that I think the way that a lot of political scientists think about consistency is misguided. So a lot of political scientists will think that, if you support, say, Christian fundamentalist morality, anti-abortion, anti-recreational drugs, anti-gay rights, and you also endorse free market libertarianism, that is a consistent moral philosophy. And insofar as you deviate from that, then you're inconsistent. And I think that is just a very wrong-headed way of thinking about what it means to be consistent. I think we should define consistency in the straightforward way of having beliefs that fit together coherently. And if you actually look at the combination of Christian fundamentalism and free market libertarianism, there's actually nothing consistent about it at all. The only reason these philosophies go together in the United States is because of a historically contingent political alliance that arose starting in the 1970s between wealthy business.
Contingent, it's a great academic word which is incredibly useful for understanding reality, because almost everything is contingent, meaning depending upon circumstance, depending on situation. Now, why do elites want to restrict speech? So regular people enjoy freedom of speech, but elites want to restrict speech. And alliance theory says this is exactly what you should expect. If you already have power, why would you want to risk your power and status? So elites sit at the center of high-status coordination networks. Their power depends on shared narratives, moral framings, and reputation systems staying stable. Speech that destabilizes those narratives threatens their status and power and transitivity. So once enemy maps fracture, elite consensus loses authority and coordination costs explode. So elites naturally have a strong structural preference for narrative control, taboo enforcement, moral gatekeeping, boundary policing, and deplatforming of norm violators. It's not because they are just uniquely censorious as personalities. It's the structure of their position in the alliance hierarchy. Open epistemic chaos is dangerous to elites. Now, regular people are different. They do not manage legitimacy systems. They do not reproduce credential hierarchies. Ordinary folks do not depend on symbolic moral authority to govern. Their alliances are local, concrete, and redundancy rich. If someone says something offensive, life goes on. No institution collapses. But for elites, the stakes are higher. A single destabilizing idea can undermine DEI regimes, threaten academic credentialing, expose policy failures, disrupt donor coalitions, fracture party discipline, trigger status loss. So elites naturally become speech risk minimizers. This is why journalists want content moderation, universities want speech codes, NGOs want misinformation laws, bureaucracies want harmful discourse regulation, corporate HR wants language compliance, tech platforms get pressured into algorithmic control. This is all priest behavior. The priest class wants control over doctrine because doctrine stabilizes their status and authority. Now, the mass public, by contrast, they live downstream of consequences, not upstream of legitimacy. So they want truth, even if it is ugly, humor, even if it is offensive, arguments, even if destabilizing, speech, even if it creates conflict. Not because they're particularly enlightened, but because their daily survival does not depend on narrative uniformity. So the divergence here is structural, not ideological. Elites want speech restriction because uncontrolled speech threatens alliance coherence. Non-elites resist because speech restriction signals elite dominance and loss of voice. This gap widens as polarization increases because the more brittle and unstable coalitions become, the more vulnerable they are, the more they fear unsanctioned truth. This is coalition boundary defense, not a dispute about data quality. So when the New York Times publishes this big, long article, genetic data from over 20,000 U.S. children, guys, misused for race science.
Genetic data from over 20,000 U.S. children misused for race science. This article is by Mike McIntyre and read by an automated voice. Genetic researchers were seeking children for an ambitious, federally funded project to track brain development, a study that they told families could yield invaluable discoveries about DNA's impact on behavior and disease. They also promised that the children's sensitive data would be closely guarded in the decade-long study, which got underway in 2015. Promotional materials included a cartoon of a black child saying it felt good knowing that scientists are taking steps to keep my information safe. The scientists did not keep it safe. A group of fringe researchers thwarted safeguards at the National Institutes of Health and gained access to data from thousands of children. The researchers have used it to produce at least 16 papers purporting to find biological evidence for differences in intelligence between races, ranking ethnicities by IQ scores, and suggesting black people earn less because they are not very smart.
Oi, they, unapproved researchers have gotten access to data. This is a shanda. So the New York Times is not worried about truth or science here. It is acting as a norm policing organ of an elite moral alliance whose legitimacy rests on a specific narrative about equality, race, and the sources of social hierarchy. So the article's function is not to lay out the truth, lay out facts, or to adjudicate psychometrics. New York Times article functions to do 3 tasks to further its alliance. Identify the enemy, right? You got researchers who are fringe. They're into race science. They're white nationalist adjacent, right? They are outside the moral perimeter, right? There's a circle of trust. They're outside the circle of trust. So their empirical claims, their truth claims, do not require any engagement, right? They are contamination, right? They do not provide propositions. So the New York Times is here to harden boundaries. We need strong boundaries against these unapproved researchers, right? We need NIH data access rules. We need prohibitions on any stigmatizing research. We need tighter controls, right? We need to prevent any transitivity, any connection between elite institutions and any conclusions, facts, or narratives that would destabilize elite rule. So when you have a data threat set that might produce results that destabilize elite rule or the elite's coalition's moral narrative, then you must reframe access. It's a security issue, guys. It's an ethics issue. It's a safety issue. We have to minimize harm. We have to protect the status of our elites. We have to protect the status of universities, the mainstream media, civil rights, NGOs, and DEI bureaucracies, right? They have a prestige network, and their authority depends on the claim that all group disparities are environmentally caused and therefore socially remediable through certain left-wing policies. Any findings that suggest anything different threaten funding, moral authority, policy legitimacy, professional status, careers. You don't want to threaten the careers of the elites, do you? So the response is not, let's replicate. The response is, this must not be allowed to exist. Now, the reporter doesn't know much about the topics in these taboo papers, and his ignorance here serves an important function. It's not an accident. It is an adaptation. If he understood the technical literature, he'd have to acknowledge uncomfortable uncertainties. He'd have to make an admission that many elite narratives rest on highly contestable empirical grounds. He would suffer a loss of moral clarity, and there would be a risk of coalition fracture. So the system selects for reporters who perform the proper moral signaling without any worry about epistemic contamination and truth and uncomfortable facts. So whenever a truth-seeking minority collides with a legitimacy-maintaining majority, both sides invoke Galileo. So dissidents say, facts do not move for politics. Institutions say, harmful knowledge must be regulated. So we get this exact pattern whenever facts and data threaten status and identity and power, when identity threatens institutions, when institutions threaten free inquiry. Now we've got security and foreign adversary, right? This is classic threat laundering. Moral condemnation alone is not enough. We have to reframe this issue as national security. It's about the children, guys, child safety. It's about data misuse. It's about extremism. It's about foreign infiltration, right? Whatever narrative we need to come up with to allow elite coercive control to be justified without openly admitting that the real concern here is about status and ideology, not about truth. So what the story is about, not IQ, not privacy, not ethics, not China. It's about who gets to define which facts are allowed to exist inside the alliance reality model. So as long as elite legitimacy depends on a strong environmental-only explanation for group outcomes, any research that destabilizes that narrative will be delegitimized, defunded, restricted from data, reframed as immoral, linked to extremism, and policed by journalists rather than debated by scientists. And the more robust the evidence becomes, the more robust the data becomes, the more intense the moralization will grow. So elite networks, universities, media, NGOs rely on a specific narrative. All group disparities result from environmental factors. So any data that suggests any 1%, 5%, 10% biological or genetic contribution to these group differences, it threatens the status protection of elite groups. So we must suppress, we must reframe access to data as a matter of ethics or security. We must have coercive control. So the reporter, Mike McIntyre, is an investigative journalist. He's not a science reporter. So he's here to focus on moral signals. He wants to frame the story around the misuse of data and security failures. Doesn't want to engage with psychometrics and the persistent nature of group differences. So he gets to categorize these dissident researcher findings as contamination. And he gets to call their research stigmatizing. When you do that, then you can justify restricting access to data that were originally intended for open science. But open science, man, that creates chaos. We need regulated knowledge, because open access, man, open access to data, that threatens the status and power and identity and policy legitimacy of the dominant coalition. And you would not want that, would you?
People and pro-life evangelicals, and that alliance does not exist in many other countries. In fact, in other countries, you see free market libertarianism being combined with more secular ideology, with being pro-choice. And so this peculiar alliance that exists in the United States is not a reflection of some deep, feature of human nature that these issues have to go together. I think they are much more historically contingent and arbitrary than we like to think. And so I don't think that political belief systems are consistent in the sense of reflecting coherent philosophies or consistently held moral principles. And I go through a lot of examples in the paper of ideological inconsistencies that are really hard to explain from that perspective, but easy to explain from my perspective.
Okay, but wait a minute, because at this point, someone might come in and say, okay, but perhaps that's true.
And their policy preferences really depend on, whether the policy is uninformed or at the very least not as
more consistent than just the general population.
Yeah, so that's generally the standard view in political science, which is that the masses are generally...
So hundreds of foreign researchers, hundreds of Chinese researchers had approved access to this data, while domestic researchers like Brian Pester were barred or investigated because their work was called stigmatizing. So the Chinese researchers were within the moral perimeter, right? They were part of the elite alliance. They were fine. But any researcher that could upset the apple cart, well, they are bad. And the data must be protected from these bad people. So you have government agencies like the NIH deciding in advance that certain questions are off limits because the answers might be stigmatizing. We've got no-fly zones. We can't talk about certain things because the social stability and status and power of elite moral narratives must take precedence over any claims about reality, empirical discovery, truth, facts, stuff like that. So you might think of science, oh, no topic is too sensitive to investigate if the method is sound. But now, thank God, we've got stigmatizing research guidelines, right? Science is no longer about what is true. Science is about what is allowed and what is useful. So we have a feedback loop where institutions only fund and publish research that confirms existing social dogmas. Any data that points toward taboo conclusions is not debated on its merits. It's a security failure. It is unethical research. And this is a survival mechanism for the prestige network. Universities, government agencies, and legacy media outlets like The Times all form an alliance, and their authority rests on the claim that they alone possess the data and the expertise to manage a fair and equal society. So if researchers use this data to show that certain disparities are resistant to elite cultural social interventions or might even have biological components, the entire professional and moral infrastructure of our ruling elite alliance faces a crisis of legitimacy, and you don't want this, do you? So the alliance uses boundary defense to cast dissidents out of the professional perimeter. These researchers are fringe. They're white nationalist adjacent. They are radioactive. They are contaminating, right? If you even look at their studies, right, you will lose your career, your funding, and your status. So this reporter's lack of knowledge, his ignorance, his lack of technical knowledge, is a benefit to the system, allows him to focus entirely on the moral wrongness of this empirical inquiry rather than to assess the validity of the findings. So this is managed ignorance, and it assures that the elite reality model remains intact and protected, even as the underlying data becomes increasingly difficult to ignore. So as long as the gatekeepers can control who has access to the data and who is allowed to speak for science, they can maintain the version of reality that serves their institutional interests, right? Regardless of any facts. So demands to shut down scientific research, shut down access to data, keep growing as the years go by and scientists keep discovering ever more non-woke facts. So here we have the New York Times running a 3,900-word article in the news section about the pressing need to crack down on science. Right? What could be more scientific than the government deciding ahead of time that nobody will be allowed to study massively important empirical questions out of fear that what scientists will discover might prove embarrassing to powerful interest groups and media influencers such as the New York Times?
Mainstream geneticists have rejected their work as biased and unscientific. Yet by relying on genetic and other personal data from the prominent project, known as the Adolescent Brain Cognitive Development Study, the researchers gave their theories an air of analytical rigor. Members of the research group were ineligible to obtain data from the ABCD project, but one of them gained access through an American professor who was already being investigated by the NIH over his handling of another child brain study.
Oh, scary stuff. But I'm here with you.
That's the name the RNC chair is calling the upcoming planned 2026 midterm convention, hoping to highlight, quote, all the incredible things that this president has done. And while Republicans rally around 47, CNN's data guy says the Democrats basically want to 86 their leaders.
Take a look at how Democrats who disapprove of congressional Democratic leaders. Hello, we're talking about 57% in January of 2026, the second highest disapproval rate for Democratic leaders from their own party on record. There's basically been no improvement. Democrats hate their own congressional leaders. These numbers are awful, awful, awful.
Crazy Crockett and Zoran the Destroyer are getting floated as the future of the Dems, but James Carville and Bill Maher both say the party should take a hard pass.
Crockett has said that Hispanics who voted for Trump have a slave mentality. That's not very smart. That will bite you in a general election.
Democrats seem to be having this debate whether or not Mayor Mamdani is a socialist or a democratic socialist. Let me settle it. He's a straight-up communist. But if liberals deny it, like he's just going through a goth phase, they're going to lose more elections. This is not a communist country.
Kaylee, the midterm convention, what are your thoughts?
I love it, and here's why.
Okay, back to analyzing this New York Times article. So this is not a failure of the science. This is science being subordinated to the needs of the ruling elite alliance. So if truth, if facts, if any empirical question threatens a coalition's power, its moral narrative, its funding, its status hierarchy, its policy legitimacy, the coalition must preempt the risk by redefining the question itself as illegitimate. So you must pre-screen what might be studied. You have to redefine inquiry as harm. You have to call outcomes dangerous rather than false. You have to treat curiosity as a security threat. You have to substitute ethics boards for empirical falsification, and you have to substitute stigma for refutation. Right? So elites are not optimizing for truth. They optimize for narrative stability, status preservation, institutional trust, donor confidence, moral authority, and transitivity across their networks. Facts, uncontrolled discovery, chaotic speech could fracture all these. So it must be labeled unethical, irresponsible, extremist, misuse, disinformation, stigmatizing. Suppression is virtue. Right, these are all the patterns of pre-modern priesthoods and ideological states. And it's not because our elites are uniquely evil, but all legitimacy systems behave the same way when their core doctrine is threatened. So real science advances by allowing hypotheses to die. Alliance systems survive by preventing certain hypotheses from being born. Psychologist Diana Fleischman writes, My favorite part of this article from the New York Times is where one of the researchers implies that her Black and Hispanic participants can't read. Here's the quote from the New York Times. Many of her study participants are Black and Hispanic and are really the targets of these racist studies, Dr. Laird says. I do believe that if we sat our families down and read them the studies, they would be upset. And in many cases, that is likely an understatement.
Their papers have provided fodder for racist posts on social media and white nationalist message boards that have been viewed millions of times. Some of the papers are cited by AI bots like ChatGPT and Grok in response to queries about race and intelligence. On the social media platform X, Grok has referred users to the research more than 24 times this month alone. It's evil, said Dr. Terry L. Jernigan, National Co-Director of the ABCD study and a neuropsychologist at the University of California, San Diego. It's not just that the science is faulty, but
it's evil, man. It's evil. I mean, what's more scientific than the label evil, right? That's like the essence of the scientific mindset. Okay, how does the pro-Israel lobby work? Right? It's a loose coalition of institutions and networks that try to keep Israel embedded inside the dominant Western alliance and keep Western elites emotionally and morally invested in Israel and its security. So the core function of the pro-Israel lobby is to preserve transitivity, so that if you're pro-America, pro-democracy, pro-West, then you should be pro-Israel. Break that link, Israel becomes isolated. So the pro-Israel network aligns Israel with U.S. foreign policy elites, Cold War anti-Soviet strategy, post-9/11 counterterrorism, liberal democratic identity, Holocaust memory, civil rights, moral language. This places Israel firmly inside the good guys coalition of the Western order. Support for Israel becomes a loyalty signal within Congress, think tanks, media, universities, evangelical churches, major donors, national security institutions. So Israel is the front line of the free world. Arabs and Islamism are the enemy. Anti-Semitism places you on the wrong side of history. Now, what's changed? The underlying alliance geometry has shifted. The Western elite coalition has fractured. Populists now distrust the national security state, NGOs, and interventionist foreign policy. Israel was long associated with those networks, so the moral language is flipped. Human rights, decolonization, and intersectionality now reclassify Israel from liberal democracy under threat to powerful white state oppressing a weaker people, white supremacist state. So this places Israel now on the wrong side of the progressive map. Now, young people are less shaped by memory of the Cold War and the Holocaust, and they're more shaped by post-colonial theory, anti-imperial narratives, campus identity politics, global South solidarity frames. So the old moral transitivity no longer holds. So the pro-Israel alliance adjusts. We see it trying to re-embed in civilizational rather than liberal language. Instead of talking about Israel's shared democratic values, the argument now shifts to Judeo-Christian civilization, Western heritage. Israel's the front line against jihadism, cultural continuity, religious freedom. So these are appeals to populist and conservative alliances that no longer trust liberal institutions, but still think in terms of civilization. So building security state and tech state transitivity, cyber, missile defense, counterterror, AI, intelligence sharing. Whatever your ideology, you need Israel operationally. So this is alliance utility rather than moral appeal. So I do notice fewer moral appeals for Israel these days. So the pro-Israel network increasingly accepts that some spaces will be lost on campus, and so they are shifting resources toward state governments, police and security partnerships, Christian evangelicals, immigrant communities, non-Western states wary of Islamism, and quiet ties with Gulf regimes. So they're hedging against moral reclassification by diversifying their patrons. So when a populist leader such as Tucker Carlson redefines the main enemy as the permanent foreign policy elite, endless war, interventionists, global institutional coordination, Israel has historically been framed as a central beneficiary of this system. The risk is alliance resorting. Israel moves from us to associated with the enemy. So the pro-Israel network wants to prevent that reclassification by separating Israel from neocon interventionism, reframing Israel as a small nation defending itself, emphasizing national sovereignty parallels, and downplaying liberal cosmopolitan NGO language. So the pro-Israel lobby is not primarily about controlling policy. It's about maintaining Israel's position inside the moral and strategic in-group of whatever coalition dominates the West. And when the ruling coalition changes, fractures, realigns, the Israel lobby's job is not just persuasion, it is alliance migration. It needs to keep Israel fused to those in power, avoid being trapped in losing coalitions prevent Israel from being recoded as a symbol of the old elite rather than as a legitimate member of the new one?
Uninformed, or at the very least not as well informed as their elite counterparts, and they sort of lack quote unquote ideological consistency. And the dominant explanation for mass opinion is that it's group centric. That is, it's rooted in sort of group attachments, group prejudices, group allegiances, and their policy preferences really depend on, whether the policy is benefiting groups they like or groups they don't like. And if it's benefiting a group they like, then they like the policy. And if it's benefiting a group they don't like, then they don't like it. And that's really the dominant approach to explaining the political beliefs of the mass public. And what's interesting is that the group attitudes of the mass public do not necessarily align with the group attitudes of political elites. That is, they're much more chaotic and unpredictable. What I want to argue is that the political beliefs of elites are in fact just as group-centric as the political beliefs of the mass public. It is just that the groups around which they center are a different set of groups, and the beliefs might be a more sophisticated set of rationalizations befitting of more intelligent, highly educated people. But that's really the only difference. That is, you see these complex political coalitions and alliances, and the most politically informed people are most attentive to the details of those political coalitions and are most willing to align themselves with those coalitions and accommodate new alliances and oppose the enemy of their enemy and befriend the ally of their ally. And that kind of loyalty and engagement is what ultimately drives their beliefs, their loyalty to the coalition as a whole, not any kind of
So you're thinking, 40, tell me, how does alliance theory explain the career trajectory of Matt Drudge? So he didn't become powerful by reporting. He became powerful by curating what mattered to a rising conservative populist alliance before that alliance had its own media infrastructure. So in the 1990s, you had legacy media ruled by a liberal elite. Conservatives were dispersed, low status, poorly coordinated, and the internet was this low-cost rival coordination channel. So Matt Drudge became the first major agenda setter for the counter-elite populist conservative coalition, and he performed three key alliance functions. He spotlighted the enemy, told the right who the real enemies were: the Clintons, media bias, cultural elites, bureaucrats, scandals that proved corruption. He created transitivity, so he linked the stories across outlets. He created a shared information space to allow conservative actors, donors, activists, and voters to see the same map of the enemy. He beat institutions to narrative framing. So first framing often wins because it defines moral interpretation before facts settle. Then Drudge became strange and drifted. So once the conservative alliance professionalized, it built its own cable networks, think tanks, digital empires, donor-funded media, social platforms. Matt Drudge's role as central coordinator became less necessary. The alliance no longer needed a single choke point. It had redundancy. Coalition itself split. You had institutional conservatives, populists, nationalists, libertarians, tech right, culture warriors. Drudge began to signal ambivalence and hostility towards Trump and the populist turn. So when a focal node no longer mirrors the dominant rival map, it loses transitivity. People stop rooting through it. His influence collapsed fast, not because he was wrong, not because he was old, not because of a better design, because Matt Drudge stopped reinforcing the emotional identity of the dominant populist, nationalist, conservative faction. He became unpredictable in loyalty signaling, and he no longer served as a morale and enemy clarity engine. So in a polarized coalition, his neutrality and contrarianism read as defection. So he was a one-man Fox News before Fox News. He was a pre-social media narrative switchboard. He was a proto-influencer without a persona. He was a central routing node for outrage and exposure. His decline came when the network no longer needed a router and the router no longer clearly belonged to one side. So he was a lone actor who became indispensable to a rising coalition. He coordinated his perception of enemies and scandal. He became obsolete when the coalition built permanent institutions, and then he was abandoned because he no longer affirmed the group's identity. Matt Drudge was less of a journalist and more of an alliance accelerator.
abstract philosophizing. Usually the abstract philosophizing comes as a justification or rationalization for whatever serves the interests of their political coalition.
So we've been focusing mostly on people here, but talking about the belief system.
That corporate CEOs make millions of dollars a year, but they actually think apparent moral principle or moral authority and tolerance. And you could go through any feature you want to identify with, say, right-wing ideology or left-wing ideology. I go through 3 different proposed features in the paper: equality, authority, and tolerance. And I go through each feature and show how the apparent moral principle or moral value is actually not held consistently. And it's only brought forward when it's in the interests of one's political allies, and it is flouted and rejected when it happens to benefit other groups, especially one's political rivals. So to take an example from the equality domain, liberals think it is unfair that corporate CEOs make millions of dollars a year, but they actually think it's fair for Hollywood movie stars to make millions of dollars a year. And so that would be an example of the type of ideological inconsistency I'm talking about, especially when you consider the fact that corporate CEOs are widely associated with conservatives and Hollywood movie stars are widely associated with liberals. And what's interesting is that you actually see the reversal among conservatives. Conservatives actually think that it's unfair for Hollywood movie stars to make millions of dollars a year. And so as soon as you swap in different groups that people feel allegiance or rivalry towards, you.
So I'm a big fan of the late academic and author Peter Novick, and he published this book around 1987, That Noble Dream, The Objectivity Question and the American Historical Profession. So you're saying, 40, tell me, what would alliance theory say about this book? So it would view it not as some kind of technical history of historiography, but it's a story about an elite alliance around a powerful status regime, around the idea of objectivity, and then how that regime coordinated a professional class of historians. So objectivity serves historians as an alliance stabilizer, right? It gives historians a coalition glue for the American historical profession. It wasn't just some kind of epistemic ideal. It was a moral marker. It told the world, we are not partisan. We don't push ideology. We are above faction. We speak for truth. So that made historians valuable allies to universities, government commissions, textbook boards, publishers, media institutions, foundations, and donors. So the objectivity claim by historians was not just a method, it was a status credential. And it let historians enter elite institutional networks with moral legitimacy. It was also a boundary marker against rivals. Coalitions need clear boundaries. So for academic historians, objectivity was a clear boundary marker against rivals. It distinguished them from polemicists, made them indispensable to schools and museums. It justified their access to archives and funding. It positioned them between scholars and the public. So it conserved and preserved the profession's status, and it helped historians monopolize certain moral terrains, such as civil rights history, national memory projects, war commemoration, institutional legitimacy, without being seen as partisan. So objectivity created a coordination signal for this coalition. Peer review became a loyalty test. Citation networks became moral signals. Methodological debates became boundary policing. Disagreements were framed as procedural, not values-oriented. So careers were based not just on truth and accuracy, but to performance of loyalty to a particular ideal that was in the profession's interest. So those who fit this normative frame got placement, funding, reputation, jobs, tenure. Those who challenged the dominant frame risked marginalization. They couldn't move ahead. Now, that objectivity is always contested, such as by feminists, post-colonial critics, Marxists, cultural historians. These are all internal alliance pressures, right? Different sub-coalitions within history have different enemy maps. Some want objectivity for institutional acceptance. Others want political relevance and moral critique. So this book is a case study of an elite status management project. Objectivity is the moral credential that granted historians entry into powerful networks and powerful amounts of funding. challengers to objectivity wanted a different moral currency. So when an elite coalition depends on a universalist status code such as objectivity, or try to police boundaries, exclude rivals, define humiliation and praise, institutionalize norms in training, and maintain high entry barriers. Now, the history profession was dominated by Anglo-Saxons, then some Catholics entered, and then some Jews entered, and very different attitudes toward populists between Jews and non-Jews. So particularly Southerners tended to have a neutral to positive frame on populism, while Jews tended to have a very negative frame on populism, because Jews thought that popular feelings are just too chaotic, too dangerous. Many of the leading Jewish historians fled Europe, fled the Nazis, and so it's just interesting how Southerners, Anglo-Saxons, tend to be much more neutral to positive about populism, while Jewish academics tend to be much more hostile. So the WASP elite tried to preserve its cultural ownership over the history profession, their moral authority, their gatekeeping rights, their aesthetic and temperamental norms, and their control of what counted as serious knowledge. So Jews were not just outsiders, they were competitors. So for a few decades, as long as it could, the history profession used ethnic coding to police entry and to signal that the true custodians of the national memory belonged to a particular class and lineage, the Anglo-Saxons. Right? History belongs to the Anglo-Saxons. That's pure alliance language. This symbolic territory is ours. Your presence threatens our status. Then after World War II, Jews enter history in large numbers, but they don't form so much a Jewish school of history. They double down on universalism and objectivity. So when a minority seeks safety inside an elite coalition, it will tend to overperform that coalition's official norms, or tend to reject particularist identity, or become the most zealous defender of universal standards, and they will signal, we are not a faction, we are the institution. So Jewish historians became the leading champions of objectivity, consensus history, anti-racism as a universal principle, and Cold War liberalism, right? Not as ethnic politics, but as a way to fuse themselves permanently into the moral center of the profession.
See their supposed principles shift and change flexibly. Another example from the equality domain, we like to think that conservatives don't care about disadvantaged groups, but when you say, should the government do more to help small working class towns in America's heartland, that is very much a right-wing coded group, and a majority of conservatives say, yes, the government should do more to help them. So it's really not a matter of being in favor of equality or inequality in the abstract or in general. It's really being strategically in favor of it when it favors the interests of one's allies, and being strategically against it when it favors the interests of one's rivals. And I'm happy to go through some of the other supposed principles as well, if you'd like me to.
Oh, yeah, sure.
So many Jewish academics saw populism through the lens of their shtetl memory. Right, so groups that have experienced bottom-up violence are structurally wary of mass mobilization. They will tend to trust institutions, prefer centralized authority, fear crowds, want the state to have a monopoly on violence, prefer elite mediation, and see popular rage as potentially genocidal. So it's not surprising that these European Jewish immigrants would develop a history scholarship that framed populism as authoritarian, proto-fascist, and psychologically unbalanced. Right, this was a way to shape threat perception.
I mean, I was just about to ask you, because there's
Republicans turned against, I don't know, the IRS, the CDC, the EPA, the WHO.
So when a profession gets rising prestige, it is incentivized to more strictly police boundaries, to hire on the basis of consensus, to avoid controversy, and prefer bland reliability over brilliance, and to be suspicious of anyone who just feels too rough and too raw. Right? It's also a way to maintain class boundary maintenance. So initially, Jews were accepted into the history profession when blacks and women were not, because the Jews entered as universalists and assimilationists. They said, we are the same as you, only we are more committed to your rules and values. then blacks and women entered the history profession, they arrived with an explicit group consciousness and moral claims that challenged the history profession's definition of neutrality and objectivity.
Government regulators, democratic politicians, even the FBI, once they started investigating Donald Trump, many Republicans turned against. These are a wide variety of authorities that Republicans reject and disrespect. So I think it is very hard to argue that they are holding a case. And if you think that it's about exercising authority over others, I think that's also hard to reconcile with their actual opinions, which involve, deregulating businesses, environmental deregulation, having fewer restrictions during COVID-19. These are hard to reconcile with a general desire to exercise authority over others. And if you look at the desire to exercise authority over others in terms of restricting their speech, you actually see little to no differences at all between liberals and conservatives. That is, people want to restrict the speech of their political opponents, but not their political allies. And you see that on both sides of the political spectrum. If anything, there might be a little bit of evidence that that is more prominent on the left these days. So I think it's hard to argue that authority or a general desire to obey or exercise authority is the unifying principle of right-wing ideology. So the other one is tolerance. So that would be a kind of tribalism or nationalism.
So another favorite Peter Novick book of mine is called The Holocaust in American Life. So why is the Holocaust so prominent in American life? The Holocaust did not happen in America. Well, the Holocaust became useful to build alliances. So you had legal institutions that embraced the Holocaust because it allowed them more power. They could push hate crime laws and anti-defamation frameworks. You had governments embracing the Holocaust because they could use it for education and remembrance. You had media and culture that produced films, museums, public commemorations. So it became a shared symbol that made disparate allies feel like they belonged to the same moral alliance, especially after the 1960s realignment when civil rights language became central to elite identity. So if you are anti-racist, right, that is an elite identity, because the normal human default is to see that any gain from any outgroup is at the cost of your in-group. So when blacks see Latinos or whites or Asians doing far better, they will understandably ask, well, how's that affecting us? Is this hurting us? And whites look at, say, the rise of blacks or Latinos or Asians and think this is coming at our expense. Every group thinks that the rise of success of some outgroup is at their expense. That's the human default. But to show that you're above that, right, by being an anti-racist, right, that is elite, because you're not down there in the grubby mess trying to accumulate more and more good things for your group. You've transcended that. You've moved above. So why was the Holocaust so useful for our ruling elite? Because it institutionalized a moral narrative. It signaled opposition to bigotry and racism and anti-civil rights sentiments. So anti-Semitism became a signal of general opposition to racism. It legitimized the post-war liberal order, it justified human rights norms, and it builds a consensus around never again. So the Holocaust becomes a story and a default moral coordinating system for governing elites, and it allows for coalition formation across political lines. So it also signaled status, right? Elites used shared moral narratives to certify their membership in a high status coalition. So the more a narrative is officially recognized, institutionalized, liturgically repeated, taught in schools, supported by law, the more it functions as an identity anchor for the coalition's moral worldview. So the Holocaust became an anchor because it was morally unambiguous. It could be used to justify many different alliances, Jews, liberals, civil rights advocates, human rights, NGOs, governments, all finding in common this narrative of evil that does not directly implicate their own side. So you could use the Holocaust moral narrative to gain power and status for your group. Symbols that help bridge various alliances, various groups, will be amplified, right? Because they are so useful. Symbols that help define outgroups clearly as the enemy are valuable in a polarized environment. So anyone opposed to civil rights is obviously the enemy. And once a coalition adopts a symbol as central to its identity, any challenges to it are treated as threats to legitimacy rather than a matter of academic debate. So the Holocaust became the central moral coordinate of American civic identity because it was useful to different groups. It was useful for alliance building, status signaling, boundary enforcement, institutional legitimacy by our ruling elite.
Or ethnocentrism that is supposed to be more prevalent among right-wing people. And I think that's equally at odds with reality. So if you ask conservatives whether we ought to be more suspicious and distrusting of foreigners, most of them will say yes. But then when you ask if we should trust Vladimir Putin when he said that he did not interfere in the 2016 election, a majority of them will also say yes. So that's quite a stark inconsistency there. That is, they think we should be distrusting of foreigners, but when it comes to a particular foreigner who is a Russian autocrat and hostile, overtly hostile to the United States, they seem to trust him quite readily. And so I think that is one of many stark inconsistencies you see on the right. And I think I list a few other examples in the paper, but you could also see similar inconsistencies on the left. That is, the left will say that they value diversity and respecting the views of a variety of different groups, but in fact they disrespect the views of any group that is mildly associated with conservatives, so Christian fundamentalists, pro-life people, white people, men, wealthy.
So New York Times, great read today is about the return of the R word. Scary, scary stuff. So saying 40, what does alliance theory teach us about the return of the R word? I remember a friend of mine in Orthodox Judaism said after Trump's 2024 election, great, now we can say the, God forbid, the F word and the R word again. So it's all about coalition signaling. It has nothing to do with your attitude towards the intellectually disabled. So if you use the R word, you're signaling, I reject the authority of the people who want to police our language. So trying to police use of the R word, right? It is a badge of elite moral control. It is a way to signal that you are educated and morally sensitive. And if you use the R word, you're saying, I don't like being hectored and badgered and policed by our ruling elite. And if you break the taboo and use the R word, you're showing your loyalty to the counter-elite, right? You are not captured by the sacred norms of our ruling elite. You do not bow down to disability advocates and DEI institutions and HR departments and the mainstream media, right? Your use of this banned word is a tribal handshake, right? You are showing defiance against the enemy. Now, you have highly visible people like Elon Musk using the term, so they create social permission for everyone below them. There was a sharp increase in usage of the R word after Elon Musk used the word in a post on X. And elites said this is normalization and boosting of hate content. Then the president uses it and produces an even larger spike. So now the MAGA coalition treats the taboo against the R word as illegitimate. And social media often rewards transgression. So a taboo word is high friction content. It provokes outrage, applause, quote tweets. Look at what they're saying now. It's a punchline. It gets attention. So the R word taboo and using the R word does two things at once. It insults an opponent as stupid, and it communicates a speaker rejects the empathy-based elite moral order that always wants to expand protected categories and minimize harm. So it's a compact way to say, I'm done with all your stupid rules and speech policing, while also humiliating a target. So if the taboo continues to function as a coalition badge, usage will stay high inside that ecosystem, and calls to shame users of the R word will backfire because they will increase the value of the badge. So the R word return is not mainly about disability. It's about who gets to set the rules of speech in 2026 and which coalition is allowed to enforce these rules.
Healthy business people, these days even pro-Israeli people. The respect for diversity is actually pretty restricted to a list of groups that are left coded.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, I'm not sure if what I'm about to say makes sense or not. Okay, so people use these.
A kind of mission statement to competing to capture people. If they like freedom, I bet you that most people will say, yeah, freedom's great. And so each party is basically competing to capture the positive vibes of freedom to mobilize support for their side. But whether each side actually consistently holds the principle of freedom is a different question. And I think the answer to that question is no, they don't. What they're trying to do is use freedom as a kind of mission statement to associate their political coalition with positive vibes. But I don't think it represents a coherent and principled philosophy, because if it were, you would see each side, valuing freedom in all cases. But that is not what you see. Another example of this kind of competition for positive and negative vibes, I think, is really clear in the abortion debate. You see, people who oppose abortion, they describe themselves as pro-life. That is, they're trying to paint themselves as the group that values life, right? They're trying to put a positive spin on their view, and in the same way, people on the pro-choice side are trying to claim the mantle of freedom, that a woman should have the right to do what she wants with her own body.
So, what is the use of the N-word from an alliance theory perspective? It is a boundary marker. It's a social tripwire. It instantly reveals which coalition you are loyal to and which coalition you reject. So it is a high voltage in-group marker. So within Black communities, use of it can function as an in-group solidarity signal. It says we share history, vulnerability, and mutual protection. And any outsider who uses the word are attempting to enter a protected alliance space without membership credentials. It's a boundary violation. It's a moral hierarchy enforcer. So for elites, prohibition of the word is a core ritual of anti-racist identity. Avoiding using it signals your moral membership in the post-civil rights coalition. You use it publicly, even in quotation or irony, will trigger punishment because the speaker must accept the authority of the ruling elite to define what is sacred and what is profane language. Now, someone in the populist or anti-woke right uses it or alludes to it provocatively. The goal is rarely to insult Black people. It really is to say, I reject your moral jurisdiction. I refuse your speech codes. I am not under your rule. So it is a perfect tool for symbolic rebellion. It is also a status weapon, right? So controlling the use of the word helps maintain the legitimacy of anti-racist institutions and the anti-racist coalition. It reveals asymmetric power. So only a group that has achieved some moral rule, some moral hegemony, can impose a linguistic taboo that strong. So the N-word remains uniquely policed far more than any other slur. So that reflects the success and the power of the Civil Rights Alliance in placing its narrative at the very center of American moral life. So the word will remain radioactive as long as the Civil Rights Alliance maintains power. Attempts to normalize it will fail as long as there is a ruling anti-racist coalition. So you would need a major realignment of racial politics and moral power and a change in the ruling elite before you would see changes in how the word is treated, who is allowed to say it, and what should be the penalties for using it.
But of course, neither side holds this principle actually consistently. People who are pro-life are happy to be pro-death when it comes to civilian casualties, when it comes to military occupations, when it comes to the death penalty, when it comes to contraception, which could actually prevent abortions. On the left, most liberals will say that a woman should have the right to do what she wants with her own body.
Look at what happened over the weekend and where we are now. Bill Malugin, who was just on, did some great reporting over the weekend about DHS, saying there is extreme frustration with DHS officials going on TV and putting out statements claiming that Alex Preddy was intending to conduct a massacre of federal agents or wanted to carry out maximum damage, even after numerous videos appeared to show those claims were inaccurate. Some of these sources have described DHS's response to the shooting as a case study on how not to do crisis PR. Another added that DHS is wrong and we are losing this war. We are losing the base and the narrative. What do you make about all of this?
Well, I'll tell you who I think agrees with that, and that's the congressional Democrats, Senate Democrats in particular, who think that they might even, be willing to do another government shutdown, poorly though they did in the last one, to keep up the fight on this whole issue of DHS and its excesses, or its alleged excesses anyway. So I think that's kind of where we are. It's all, to some extent, a subset of the never-ending struggle against Donald Trump. But I think that the extravagant statements by these DHS officials, ICE officials, and the DHS secretary over the weekend didn't play well. And such polling as there is, Brett, suggests that people think ICE and DHS have gone too far, and they're not winning the PR war in Minnesota.
Well, it seems like President Trump acknowledges that to some extent as well, sending Tom Homan in, having these conversations with the Minnesota governor and Minneapolis mayor as well.
Oh, yeah, I don't think there's any doubt. He's taken quite a different posture from DHS officials and from Kristi Noem in particular out there. He did, after the first person was killed out there, he talked about how tragic he thought it was, and he's withholding judgment on this one, waiting for the end of the investigation, which is what a great many people, including some obviously in DHS, according to Bill, think that the officials on the scene out there should have done as well, is to wait for this and for a full investigation to be done on this to conclude what exactly happened out there.
But to your point, just to finish up, you do think that Democrats see this as a political opportunity, or at least see the benefit here in stirring the pot on this government shutdown possibility. The last government shutdown did not work out well for Democrats. It was 43 days. This one, if it happens, would be about funding DHS, even though ICE has been funded through 2029.
Yeah, my thought about that is that the last words that Bill Malugin spoke there about the parts of that agency that would be affected, FEMA and the Transportation Department, are a good example of, or at least that part of the Transportation Department would be affected by that. So I don't think it's good politics to do a shutdown, but the fact that they're even talking about it tells you all you kind of need to know about where people in the Democratic Party at least think the politics are these days.
Yeah, and we'll see what the polls show us as well in coming days. Britt, as always, thank you.
So why do Australians use the C word, see you next Tuesday, just to show affection, right? You like someone, you call them the C word. But in America, it's a really bad word. So in Australia, the dominant masculine coalition, the mateship coalition, is working class, egalitarian, anti-pretension, anti-elite, and anti-sentimentality. So you earn status in the dominant Aussie masculine coalition by showing that you are not thin-skinned, not easily offended, and not performatively refined. And so harsh language is a solidarity token. So calling someone the C word signals we're all equals. We're not standing on ceremony around here. You, good to see you, C words. We're not playing moral superiority games. We are all inside the same rough, trust-based in-group. So the word functions as an in-group bonding insult. It's not a moral transgression. It marks toughness and anti-snob alliance membership. Now, in the United States, the dominant moral coalition around sex is different. It's highly influenced by feminism, feminist institutions. It's strongly shaped by HR, university, and legal norms. It's focused on protecting historically vulnerable categories, and it is heavily invested in language as moral regulation. So the same word is encoded not as a form of rough camaraderie, but as sexual degradation, historical misogyny, threat signaling, power asymmetry. It is a boundary violation token. It's not a bonding token. Using it signals that you reject the moral authority of the Gender Equality Coalition. It doesn't show that you're friendly to equality. So words become taboo or casual based on who wields power, who is morally protected, which groups control institutional enforcement, what type of masculinity is high status, is solidarity demonstrated through toughness or through care. So Australian elite culture has never fully moralized speech around sex the same way that Anglo-American academic and corporate institutions do. So even the Australian elite alliance system still prizes mateship, thick skin, mockery as a form of bonding, anti-hierarchy talk, and status leveling through insult. By contrast, the US elite alliance prizes emotional safety, symbolic inclusion, language purity, moral signaling through restraint. So the same word, the same see you next Tuesday word in Australia means you are one of us. In America, it means you are attacking a protected class and you reject the moral order. So the offensiveness of a word is not inherent. It is a product of which coalition controls moral prestige and which violations signal loyalty versus hostility. So the C word is acceptable where rough egalitarianism is the core alliance virtue. It is taboo where moralized protection and institutionalized sensitivity rule.
Wants to say purchase private health insurance or not wear a seatbelt or drink a large sugary soda or have sex for money. These are all views that are pretty common on the left, and they are pretty inconsistent with the idea that we should generally have the right to do what we want with our own bodies. So that would be my case there.
Yeah, and I brought that to the table. I mean, people basically using the same term or referring to the same principle, but with different meanings, because sometimes...
So why are Australians so bloody racist? Jim Goad said that he found Aussies about the most racist people around, but that they were governed by an elite and a media that was even more anti-racist than America's. So presuming there's an ounce of truth to Jim Goad's observation, you ask me, 40, what would alliance theory say about this? So alliance theory says there is a mismatch between mass culture and elite culture. Right? Different coalitions use different moral currencies. In any society, elites and non-elites belong to different moral alliances. So Australian mass culture grows out of working class male bonding, anti-pretension, egalitarianism, status leveling through insult and mockery, and low tolerance of moral grandstanding. So in this alliance environment, people use blunt, ethnic, and abrasive language as in-group testing, status leveling, and signaling that you are not fragile or sanctimonious. This looks racist by elite moral standards, even when it functions socially as boundary roughening rather than exclusion, and crude joking rather than moral hierarchy enforcement. Now, why are elites so hyper anti-racist? Because elites tend to operate in transnational status networks. Elite legitimacy membership depends on alignment with global human rights norms, shared language with US and European institutions, being at ease and part of the university, NGO, media prestige circuits, and you are fluent in international moral signaling. So elite Australian cultural imports often overperform the anti-racist language of the Anglo-American professional class, right? Because they want to optimize for their global coalition acceptance. Now, mass Aussie culture optimizes for local trust and toughness and egalitarian signaling. So mass Aussie norms reward bluntness and mockery. Elite norms reward linguistic purity and moral signaling. So everyday talk in Australia sounds harsh by American standards. Elite talk in Australia sounds sanctimonious and foreign by American standards. Each side reads the other as morally defective. Elites hear cruelty and prejudice in mass talk. Masses hear censorship and performative virtue in elite talk. Countries such as Australia, Canada, and the US share a structure. You have indigenous displacement, you have large immigrant populations, you have strong international human rights alignments among elites, you have rough frontier or working class cultural traditions among non-elites. So elites lean hard into universalist moral language to maintain secure their legitimacy. Non-elites have thicker skins and they prefer status-flattening speech norms. So you have a moral style gap. So what is often described more racism versus more anti-racism is usually a clash between a rough, egalitarian, insult-tolerant mass alliance culture and a globally networked, morally performative elite alliance culture. They are playing different signaling games. They are optimizing for different audiences. They are using different moral currencies, and they are enforcing different status codes.
In political debate,
on being kind. I think that's what I would call a social. But I think you see the exact same. In order to make money, you have to convince people that you're not interested in making money. And I think that's what I would call a social. But I think you see the exact same phenomenon in the political world. In order to gain power, you have to convince people that you're not interested in gaining power. That instead what you're interested in is making the world a better place, generally making things better for everyone, being kind and generous and fair and patriotic and virtuous and all those sunny things. But really, politics is a competition to gain control of the coercive apparatus of the state, which literally forces people to do things by threat of imprisonment. And that is a scary thing. And nobody has ever gained power by saying that that's what they want. I want to gain control of the coercive apparatus of the state so that I can boss people around and force them to do things by threat of imprisonment. No one has ever gotten elected by saying that. Just as no business has ever made money by saying, all I want to do is make as much money as possible. I don't care about values or the environment.
Now, well, may you be thinking, 40, what does alliance theory have to say about the Nathan Cofnas career trajectory, right? Nathan Cofnas is an intellectual who has deliberately placed himself in a structurally dangerous but potentially powerful alliance position. He is the internal truth-testing dissident inside a stigmatized coalition, right? He has entered a space dominated by the distant right and a coalition that has strong in-group loyalty, high boundary costs, severe social stigma, weak elite bridges, and high epistemic insulation. So within this group, status comes from reinforcing group narratives and attacking outside taboos, not from exposing internal errors. Now, Cofnas has done the opposite of what is expected. He attacked the intellectual foundations of the very coalition that had given him an initial audience. So he shifted from an in-group legitimizer to a boundary violator and a transitivity breaker. He challenged core claims, methodological sloppiness, and motivated reasoning. So that makes him high status to outsiders and truth-seeking elites. He is low status and morally suspect to the dissident right in-group he criticized. So this is the classic heretical reformer Martin Luther position. It is psychologically lonely, but structurally important. His current niche is unstable, but interesting. He now occupies a rare alliance role. He is a figure who is technically competent, hyper-educated, willing to enter forbidden spaces, hostile to ideological capture, and not aligned with the moral language of either the progressive academic coalition or the dissident right identity coalition. So people like Nathan Cofnas have three possible futures. He could be absorbed by the elite alliance. He could become a valued internal skeptic. He could be used as a controlled heterodox node, like early critics of Freudianism, right? If the elite alliance decides that credibility and robustness matter more than moral purity, they will want to absorb Nathan Cofnas. He could remain a permanent liminal dissident, right? He may remain in a structural no man's land. He may be distrusted by the populist right for debunking their cherished claims. He will be distrusted by the left for even touching certain topics. This is the fate of many truth-oriented boundary crossers. They become intellectually respected but institutionally marginal. Think of people who are right too early and in the wrong moral climate. Third possibility, he may become an alliance entrepreneur. Right? His work may become valuable. He could become one of the figures who kills off discrediting ideologies and creating space for a new coalition. He may gain prestige even if he never gains mass popularity. So Nathan Cofnas is not optimizing for mass following, mass loyalty, identity affirmation, donor comfort, platform safety. He optimizes for truth, epistemic coherence, internal consistency, and status among a tiny but highly competent audience. So the Nathan Cofnas audience will always be tiny, but potentially highly influential in elite realignments. So his danger and his opportunity are the same. Nathan Cofnas threatens existing alliances by telling them uncomfortable truths. He becomes valuable when alliances need to clean house. So right now he's marginalized, he's under suspicion, he's attacked from all sides. In the medium term, he may develop niche authority among heterodox scholars and serious journalists. Long term, he may be absorbed into the elite as a useful skeptic, or he may stay an outsider with high intellectual but low organizational power. So he's structurally positioned not to lead a movement, but to invalidate a movement's false self-conception, which is often more important looking back in history than in founding new movements.
Or whatever. So I think we have these social paradoxes, these tensions in our mind that in order to pursue our goals, we cannot admit the goals we're pursuing. And I think we can't even admit them to ourselves a lot of the time. I think a lot of people at Starbucks would probably believe their own bullshit, that they really are trying to inspire and nurture the human spirit. And I think most committed partisans and ideologues also believe their own bullshit, that they really are trying to pursue this impartially altruistic vision to better humanity in the world.
But when it comes to the social dynamics themselves, so for example, things like social identity, and you are also trying to reframe, for example,
social identity theory, the idea that we have an in-group and we have an out-group, and it's a monolithic in-group and against a monolithic out-group, and they're fixed and they stay the same, and we do things and believe things to make us feel better about our in-group, to enhance our self-esteem, and we do things that make the out-group look worse to enhance our self-esteem. That is the vision coming out of decades of research in social psychology. I think that vision is deeply flawed for a number of reasons. For one thing, if you actually look at the group dynamics in small-scale hunter-gatherer, forager societies, it is nothing like the monolithic in-group against the monolithic out-group. It is.
So how does alliance theory explain Ben Shapiro's career success, right? He is a high-status bridge node between two conservative alliance systems that usually distrust each other, the populist mass right and the professional credentialed elite. So he emerged as a prodigy at UCLA and Harvard Law School. He demonstrated high IQ, elite education, Jewish religious seriousness, constitutional originalism, and media competence. He was an elite legitimacy provider. He reassured donors, lawyers, parents, and institutions that the conservative coalition had smart, articulate, morally serious representatives who could fight on prestigious terrain. At the same time, he mastered populist signaling. He clearly named the enemy. He went after universities, the left, media, Hollywood, and wokeness. He provided emotional clarity and moral absolutism without vulgarity, emotional clarity without demagoguery, religious conviction without sectarianism. So he could be trusted by the populist base and by the establishment and the donors. Right, the Daily Wire, his creation is an alliance infrastructure. He's not just a pundit, he builds an institution. He moved from performer to coalition organizer. So the Daily Wire provides narrative synchronization, boundary policing, elite respectability, youth recruitment, donor confidence, and culture counterproduction. It is a full-on alliance reproduction machine. He gives not just commentary, but films, content for children, educational material, celebrity recruitment. He has shifted from arguing politics to building a parallel moral civilization. Initially, he opposed Trump, but then when the mass Republican coalition sided with Trump, then Shapiro chose to follow them. He kept up certain procedural criticisms of Trump's behavior while fully realigning with the populist right. So he was able to preserve elite trust and restore trust from the base. Very few figures pulled that off. So he occupies a rare structural niche. He's not an academic, he's not an activist, he's not a party operative. He's a coalition legitimizer with mass emotional access. So he reassures parents that conservatism is smart and decent. He reassures donors that it is institution ready. He reassures religious Jews and Christians that his way is morally grounded. He reassures young men who want combat and fearlessness. So Ben Shapiro is hard to replace because he connects religion to secular politics, populism to professionalism, outrage to argument, mass identity to elite respectability. So he has survived the populist revolution instead of being swept aside by it. So his career is built not on being right, fast, witty, clear. Right? He is a reliable bridge between the conservative movement's emotional base and its institutional aspirations and the donor class.
There's very much complex strategic rivalries occurring within groups. They're constantly fissioning and fusioning. They're called fission-fusion societies, literally. Like they have small bands of around 20 or 30 people, and then they form larger groups, and then they split apart. And so it's much more complicated and dynamic than the picture of one tribe on one side of the river and another tribe on the other side of the river. I think we are much more politically savvy and sophisticated than this kind of caveman tribalism that has come out of.
So how did Charlie Kirk become so successful? According to alliance theory, he became a central, indispensable node in the conservative coalition, especially among young people. He strategically coordinated identity, enemy maps, and emotional loyalty. Right? He tapped a latent allied group and he gave it a shared enemy map. Right? He became the emotional focal point for his alliance. He networked upward to donors and political power center. He rode existing dominant alliance trends. He exploited new media alliances. He filled a coordination gap between young conservatives and establishment conservatism. And he was a person who made conservative youth feel seen, aligned, and mobilized. And then he was the coordinator that connected them to donor networks and the broader Republican Party. He was an alliance builder, signal amplifier. Now, who could succeed Charlie Kirk? It'd be someone who could signal, we are one side and these are our enemies. Someone who can emotionally bind a base of young conservatives and then bridge that base to donors, institutions, and power.
Social identity theory. And so what I try to replace this picture with is, instead of talking about in-groups and out-groups, which is misleading in a variety of ways, I think it's more illuminating to talk about alliances, to talk about allies and rivals and conflicts within groups. So I can walk you through some of the ways in which this in-group, out-group thing breaks down. So you might expect that in order to favor a group, you would have to be in that group. They would have to be in your in-group, and in order to oppose a group, they would have to be your out-group, but that's just manifestly not the case. You don't have to be a black person to feel.
Now, I know most of my viewers right now, they're just dying to build a career fighting anti-Semitism. So how do you build a career fighting anti-Semitism? Through the lens of alliance theory. You have to become a valuable node in an alliance network that defines, monitors, and responds to threats against Jews. So you're not just opposing hatred. You have to help multiple coalitions coordinate around protection, legitimacy, and narrative. You have to ally with Jewish communal institutions, state and legal authorities, media and cultural elites, academics and NGO networks, Israel-focused networks, right? So you need to become the threat interpreter. You need to translate incidents, ideologies, and movements into clear enemy maps. Who is doing this bad thing? Why now? How it fits into larger patterns? What it means for community safety and politics. You need to become the legitimizer. You have to frame Jewish particularist concerns in universalist moral and legal language that allies can act on without reputational risk. You have to ally and connect yourself with civil rights, hate crime laws, democratic norms, minority protections. You have to become a bridge builder. You connect Jews to non-Jewish allies who can provide protection, resources, and political backing. You have to connect with police chiefs, university presidents, mayors, corporate leaders, editors. You become the boundary enforcer. You name when rhetoric or movements cross from criticism into demonization or exclusion. You turn diffuse anxiety into organized response. You organize training, security planning, advocacy campaigns, coalition statements, court cases, legislative action. You become institutionally embedded. You develop scarce expertise. Right? You become the go-to guy on campus anti-Semitism, online extremism, legal advocacy, security and threat assessment, Middle East narrative warfare, Holocaust distortion, data and monitoring. You have to cultivate elite trust with rabbis, donors, presidents, editors, police, prosecutors. You become the person they call first. You have to learn the language of multiple worlds, Jewish history and trauma, civil rights, media framing, political strategy, security logic. Right? Success comes from being a stable bridge in a polarized environment. Failure comes from being coded as a purely partisan or purely symbolic figure. So those who make a living out of fighting anti-Semitism, you have to demonstrate that you are making Jews safer in concrete ways. You have to help institutions act rather than posture. You have to translate emotion into strategy. You have to maintain credibility across rival camps. You have to keep your moral clarity without collapsing into performative outrage. There's the ticket for your career in fighting anti-Semitism.
Feel as if you are an ally of black people. And you don't have to be a police officer to feel as if you are an ally of police officers. You don't have to be an Israeli to feel pro-Israel. You don't have to be a Palestinian to be pro-Palestinian. You do not have to be in a group to be an ally of that group. Alliances can occur between groups, and the same thing occurs within groups. You don't have to, you can be a white person and feel enmity toward white people. In fact, a lot of white progressives feel that way about white people. You can be an American and feel negatively toward Americans. A lot of progressives hold that view as well. You can be a poor person and feel antipathy toward poor people. You can be a rich person and feel antipathy toward rich people.
So I know much of my audience wants to build a career as a Chabad rabbi, going out to a community with no shuls, very few Jews. Right? How do you build a career as a Chabad rabbi? Right? You have to make yourself indispensable. Right? Your career grows if your alliance grows and you become irreplaceable. You have to create a visible identity anchor. Right? Chabad succeeds because it offers clear, warm, non-judgmental in-group marker, public holidays, Jewish rituals, Shabbat candles, menorah lightings, Purim, Pesach, Seders. Right? These are not programs. These are boundary signals that tell isolated Jews there is a tribe here and you are in it. You have to become the personal loyalty focal point. So in a low-density Jewish environment, relationships matter more than institutions. You have to visit sick Jews in hospital, go to their funerals. You have to tutor bar mitzvah kids, pastoral calls, crisis support. Interdependence creates loyalty. When people need you at their most vulnerable moments, the alliance crystallizes around you. Every small town has doctors, professors, business owners, interfaith families, Israelis, retirees, students. Your job is to find them, connect them to each other, and make yourself the hub. Once Jews discover each other through you become structurally central. You have to build donor patrons. Right? A tiny number of families will have disproportionate resources. Treat them as partners in a civilizational project, not just as check writers. Give them status, involvement, and legacy. Right? Patronage plus emotional meaning is the fastest way to stabilize a new coalition. Create high commitment rituals. Signal connection to the global Chabad super alliance. Play the long demographic game. Avoid local faction traps. Make Jews feel less alone, make their children feel proud of being Jewish, make their lives visibly better with Torah and community, become the person through whom Jewish connection flows in your town. That's your ticket to becoming a successful Chabad Shaliach, emissary.
And these phenomena are much easier to understand when you realize that there are rivalries within groups. That is, within the group of rich people, there are different subcultures. Within the group of poor people, there are different subcultures, perhaps ethnic rivalries between lower class white people and lower class ethnic minorities, et cetera, et cetera. So I think if we view politics from the lens of ever-shifting alliances and rivalries, I think that is going to be a much more illuminating and insightful way of understanding things than in terms of cheering for some monolithic in-group against some monolithic out-group that never changes.
Now, you're saying, 40, I'm modern Orthodox, right? I'm not so Orthodox. I'm modern Orthodox. How do I build a career as a modern Orthodox congregational rabbi? Well, I am glad you asked. This is what alliance theory would say. You must bridge alliances. You must create alliances with the rabbinic elite, those who run yeshivas, senior rabbis, seminary networks, those who rule on Jewish law, poskim, right? Those who control ordination, prestige, references, placement pipelines. You have to build alliances to lay leadership, board members, major donors, search committees, the people who control budgets, contracts, and tenure. You have to build alliances to the professional class. Right? Modern Orthodox Jews tend to be professionals, doctors, lawyers, accountants, dentists, tech people, educators. Right? This class wants cultural fluency, intellectual seriousness, emotional steadiness. They want you to be both secularly educated and educated in Torah. You have to build Alliances with youth and families, schools, camps, gap year alumni, young couples, right? They determine the community's future and energy. You have to build alliances with Israel and the wider Jewish world, right? You have to become a reliable bridge. You have to be able to speak yeshiva Hebrew and boardroom English. You have to have depth with Jewish law and emotional intelligence. You have to have tradition and competence, right? You have to translate between worlds. You have to signal loyalty without rigidity. Right, you are loyal to halakha, Jewish law, and you are open to the best of modernity. You are clearly inside the Orthodox boundary, but you do not threaten the professional class with sectarian intensity. You have to build elite patronage early, right? You have to master pastoral presence. You have to control the moral temperature, right? Do not let political, religious, or generational factions define each other as enemies. You are the one who preserves the sense of one people in one shul. You have to protect institutional legitimacy, respect process, work with boards, avoid humiliating lay leaders, maintain discretion, keep the interpersonal factional drama low. What will derail your career? Publicly humiliating donors or board members, signaling contempt for the professional class, aligning too tightly with one faction in your shul, undermining senior rabbinic authority, neglecting pastoral availability, letting your personal ideology override coalitional stability. What will build your career? Your calming crisis. You have clear halakhic authority and human warmth. You're intellectually serious without being arrogant. You're loyal to the community. You're honest with people, and you have the ability to bless rather than to polarize. So you can succeed as a modern Orthodox congregational rabbi if you are a moral anchor, a boundary keeper, a bridge between Torah and modernity, a trust node between elites and families, a stabilizer in moments of fear and change. So you don't rise by being the most radical, the most brilliant. You rise by being the one that everyone feels safe with.
And when it comes to the alliances,
be less likely to have conflicts and disagreements. The easiest example of this is if allies speak the same language, they're going to have an easier time working together. But they could also speak the same language of their subculture and have an easier time working together. Or they could have, similar personality quirks, and they might, be less likely to have conflicts and disagreements with one another because they're more similar in that vein. A marker might help to create common knowledge of the alliance itself. That is, you see this in sports. One team wears red shirts, the other team wears blue shirts, and that helps everyone coordinate who's on whose side. We do the same thing with our alliances and rivalries. And I think one of the reasons why racism is so pernicious is because there are visible differences that are common knowledge to everyone in terms of skin color and outward appearance. And that helps make it easier for people to coordinate who's on whose side. The second one is transitivity. So that is summed up by the following statements. The enemy of my enemy is my friend. The friend of my friend is my friend. The friend of my enemy is my enemy. And the enemy of my friend is my enemy. These statements taken together are what I call transitivity, the sharing of allies and enemies. And there are pretty solid functional reasons why we would want transitive allies versus intransitive allies. That is, it mitigates two major costs. One is infighting. That is, we don't want our allies getting into conflicts with one another. Because if they get into conflicts, then we're going to have to be forced to choose sides. We're going to have to be forced to choose between them. And that means we're going to lose one of our allies and potentially gain a new enemy, which is really bad for us. So we want our allies to get along. And we also want our allies to share.
Yes, don't put smack in the chat. One love. Right. Next, career. How do you build a career in talk radio? Right. It's not a marketplace for argument. It is a marketplace for coalition, coordination, and identity maintenance. A successful career comes from being a reliable node in an alliance network, not from being the most accurate and truth-telling analyst. So talk radio rewards repetition, emotional synchronization with your audience, clear friend-enemy distinctions, ritual outrage, and parasocial loyalty. Right, listeners tune in less to find out truth and facts. They tune in to feel anchored to their side. So the host's job is to name the in-group, right? Patriots, right-thinking Americans, MAGA. Name the out-group, the globalist liberal elite. Reassure the in-group of its moral status. You patriots, you're the good guys. Explain defeats as a result of betrayal and conspiracy, and celebrate small symbolic victories. So you build your career by picking your in-group, and you are not ambiguous. Ambiguity breaks transitivity. Listeners need to know instantly whose side you're on and that you will not defect. So consistency is more valuable to your career in talk radio than nuance. You need to become the emotional focal point. You have to be the host to make listeners feel understood, angry in the same way, morally justified, the loyalty anchor. People need to emotionally fuse with your voice, then they return daily. You have to be a master at telling stories about the enemy. You have to tell a coherent story about the enemy, the institutions, the people, the forces who are villains. Right? This stabilizes the enemy map, and it gives your audience a sense of cognitive ease. You have to police internal boundaries. You have to call out the sellouts, the rhinos, the Republicans in name only, the radicals, the extremists. Right? You have to become the guardian of group purity. You are the loyalty enforcer. You have to develop a persona. It's not about your opinions. You're not a policy analyst. You're a tribal elder, a comic, a preacher, a brawler. You must be emotionally legible and repeatable. People must be able to read you and relate to your emotions. Truth is secondary. Radio is fast, daily, and competitive. Selection pressure is for speed over verification, narrative coherence over uncertainty, moral clarity over complexity. Right? Claims have to be evaluated by whether they strengthen in-group morale, humiliate the enemy, fit our established story, and travel well emotionally. Accuracy matters. Truth matters only when it serves those functions. Status advertisers and syndicators care about your audience size, your listener loyalty, your predictable alignment, and your low risk of alienating the core base. So you have to become a dependable identity reinforcement machine. Right? That's more valuable than the host who is brilliant but disruptive. Your income and your status depend on your alliance role. You can't revise your worldview. You can't soften your description of the enemy. You cannot admit uncertainty. Your audience enforces orthodoxy. Deviations are punished with silence, outrage, and abandonment. If you want a career in political talk radio, you have to become a trusted in-group voice, a stable classifier of the enemy, an emotional synchronizer, and a reliable loyalty signal.
Our enemies, because if an ally is friendly toward our enemies, well, they might side with our enemies and betray us. And that is really bad for us as well. So for that reason, we really we look to transitivity when deciding who we want to ally with and who we don't. And we also try to accommodate new allies by
peace process,
by being transitive with.
Trilateral meetings in Abu Dhabi, Russia, Ukraine, U.S. Zelensky touts constructive trilateral talks in Abu Dhabi. Putin aide Yuri Ushakov said the extremely frank discussions lasted roughly 4 hours, included U.S. officials updating Moscow on their recent conversations with Ukrainian and European leaders. Territorial issues remain a key obstacle in the negotiations, with Moscow pressing Kyiv to relinquish parts of eastern Ukraine's Donbas region that Russian forces do not fully control. Back with the panel, starting there. Meredith, I mean, we've heard this song before.
We have. I mean, I do think that these trilateral talks, this was the first time this has happened since Russia invaded Ukraine. And it does seem that some progress was made. At the very least, they've agreed to that they need to have some sort of compromise and come to an agreement. But that territorial issue remains outstanding. We did hear Ukrainian President Zelensky say that they have a security agreement with the U.S. That's yet to be seen or signed, but at least it is a step forward. They're going to be meeting again next week. But the optimist in me sees this as progress, but the pessimist also sees that this could be a tactic by the Russians simply to evade sanctions that Trump has threatened.
Yeah, and that was Senator Shaheen's point, Guy, about putting the squeeze on. There are multiple bills up there, including Lindsey Graham's, to really sanction those who do business with Russia, and whether that's going to happen or not.
Right, because it feels like we're spinning our wheels. I'm sure President Trump genuinely wants to help shepherd this war to a conclusion, but it's a war that was started by Russia, it is maintained by Russia, and Russia doesn't seem to be terribly interested in getting out of it, constantly making all these demands, agreeing to talk. The Ukrainians are like, hey, yes, Here's our answer. Yes, we want peace. Here's a security agreement. Of course, they have their own issues, but they are not the obstacle to this. And until the status or the calculation changes inside the Kremlin and Putin thinks that the status quo is no longer acceptable, which it has been for years now for him, I don't know where things actually change, and maybe really biting sanctions would be something that would change his thinking, potentially.
Speaking of changing thinking, the situation with Iran, the U.S. military is now getting into position and a lot more assets in the region. The president saying Iran wants a deal. U.S. Armada arrives. He declined to discuss the options presented to him by his national security team or which one he prefers. At the same time, if we put up that quote, they want to make a deal. Speaking about the Iranians, I know so. They called on numerous occasions. They want to talk. Possible, Kevin?
It is possible. I think, as we've talked about this before, Brett, one of the motivating factors.
So how do you build a career as a right-wing pundit? Right? It's not about being correct, accurate, truthful, original, or even persuasive. It's about finding and occupying a valuable alliance niche in a polarized coalition, and then signaling your loyalty, your usefulness, and your distinctiveness to that coalition. So in a polarized environment, audiences do not seek truth, clarity, information. They want alliance reinforcement. They want confirmation of who the enemy is, validation of their own superior moral status. They want narratives that explain their group's humiliation and the threats that it faces, and they want voices that sound like one of us, but smarter. So a successful right-wing pundit is not a truth broker. He's an identity coordinator and boundary enforcer. So he needs to name the enemy. Has to excel at identifying enemies and outgroups and betrayal. Media, universities, bureaucrats, NGOs, globalists. Status comes from sharpening the enemy map and making it emotionally legible. Right-wing pundit needs to become the legitimizer, provide the historical, legal, and philosophical justification for whatever it is that the base feels. You have to translate their anger into serious moral language so elites and donors can align with it without shame. You have to become the boundary policeman. You have to attack defectors and heretics, the never-Trumpers, the moderates, the rhinos, the compromisers. This raises in-group cohesion and makes you indispensable as a loyalty signaler. You have to become the bridge figure. You have to speak to the base and to the institutions. You have to reassure donors, courts, media, and foreign allies while keeping populist credibility. How does the money flow in? Audience attention, subscription loyalty, donor patronage, platform indispensability. Can't be peripheral, ambiguous, or easily replaced. You have to have a clear identity, a predictable alignment, an emotional reliability, a distinctive voice. Truth is secondary. Truth doesn't have any value in high conflict coalitions. What matters more is, does this help us? Does this hurt them? Does this make our side feel stronger, smarter, more superior, and more justified? Accuracy and truth is rewarded only when it serves those functions. When it doesn't, it must be deprioritized. Polarization will help your career. Polarization raises the demand for daily narrative coordination, moral reassurance, ritual outrage, identity maintenance. There's a permanent market demand for pundits who can speak with moral certainty, project courage, name taboos, name the enemy, and perform defiance. The more intense the alliance conflict, the more valuable such performers become. Now, once your status and income depends on your position in the coalition, you lose freedom. You cannot revise your map of the enemy. You cannot soften boundary lines. You cannot question core narratives. Your audience is your enforcement mechanism. The right-wing pundit who makes it is not just monetized, he is structurally captured by his audience. So to make a living as a right-wing pundit, you must become a trusted emotional node, a reliable classifier of the enemy, a status-enhancing voice for your side, inside a polarized coalition. Truth and originality may be useful, but only if they aid people feeling superior to their enemy.
Behind this president is when he sees innocents massacred, whether they be on the streets of Kyiv, women and children, in Syria, and certainly in Tehran and the surrounding provinces and all provinces across Iran. That is certainly a motivating factor for this president, obviously with the repositioning of the Lincoln now in the vicinity, as Jennifer Griffin just reported. But, you know, it is anyone's guess what kind of military options are really in place. We saw a decapitation campaign, certainly, obviously, with Maduro in Venezuela. It's a bit more complicated in a country much more larger by population and size as to what those military options include. But I do think the president should be motivated and is motivated to act, especially if we see upwards of 30,000 innocent Iranians slaughtered by this regime.
So just a little flashback. Remember when the foreign minister came here on Special Report? Take a listen.
So, well, you ask, 40, how do I get ahead in academia? What does alliance theory have to say? Well, your academic career is not built on discovering truth. It is built on successfully navigating, signaling, and climbing within alliance networks that control prestige. You need to be central to the power coalition. You don't need to be right. Every field has a dominant alliance made up of prestige departments, top journals, grant agencies, senior scholars, conference gatekeepers, editorial boards. So this alliance defines what questions are important, what methods are legitimate, what counts as rigor, what moral posture is acceptable, what language signals moral seriousness. So optimizing for truth is not going to advance your career in the academy. You need to optimize for transitivity. You need to ensure that your advisors' allies become your allies, that your citations align with those who have power, that your work flatters and extends dominant frameworks, and that your conclusions do not threaten your coalition's moral self-image. Publishing is an alliance ritual. Your paper is not just an argument, it is a loyalty signal. You have to show that you know the right people, you read the right people, you cite the right people, you frame problems in the right way, and you do not destabilize cause assumptions of the elite who dominate your field. Peer review is not about filtering for truth. It is boundary policing by the alliance's centuries. How do you grow your prestige? Find a powerful mentor, become a part of their lineage, co-author with the powerful, defend their framework, inherit their network, create or join a rising sub-alliance, find a new method, a new moral frame, a new interdisciplinary space. If it grows, you grow with it. Become the moral and theory enforcer. Define what is acceptable and unacceptable. Police language. Expose deviance and heresy. This raises your visibility and your value to your coalition as a guardian. Originality and truth optimization is dangerous. Right? Truth and novel ideas threaten transitivity. They confuse ally-enemy maps. They disrupt citation networks. They make reviewers and your peers and those with power uncertain which side you're on. Innovation, very dangerous, man. You need to follow the proper ideology and morality. These are alliance glue. You have to take and show the correct moral stance signals that you're one of us, you share our enemies, you will not embarrass the group, you can be trusted with status. Right? Disagreement on facts can be tolerated, but disagreement on moral framing cannot. Now, why do some scholars become stars? It's not because they're smart, original, truth optimizing. They become focal nodes. They coin a language that others can use. They name enemies. They provide identity to a subgroup. They bridge elites and students. They generate transitivity across departments and elites and institutions. They become alliance coordinators, not just researchers. Academic success is mainly about correctly identifying who has power, citing those who have power, aligning with the moral and theoretical commitments of those who have power, embedding yourself in the networks of those who have power, avoid saying anything that is threatening to those who have power, and become a node that other people want to connect to, right? Your prestige will follow your position in the alliance.
Saying it's less than 1,000 people.
No, hundreds of people. I certainly, deny the numbers and figures they have said. It is an exaggeration. It is a misinformation campaign only to find excuses to do another aggression against Iran.
I mean, he said it over and over and over again, and now you have Time Magazine, other quoting people on the ground, local government health officials saying that number, to your point, Kevin, could top 30,000 on the ground. We'll see where that all goes. Panel, thanks so much.
Thanks.
Finally tonight, a special day. All right, as this massive winter weather system dumps snow on the Northeast, Sean White,
okay, let's get forward
our
to
Common Ground segment,
Laura
a
Ingraham.
bipartisan effort to make purchasing a home still unafraid.
Where's
The
Laura
Ingraham
Ingraham? She's a
starts
patriot.
now.
my fellow patriots. I'm so excited to share this with you. It's the Ingram
Good
Angle.
evening, everyone. I'm Laura Ingram. This is the Ingram Angle from a chilly Washington tonight. More chaos in Minnesota after another deadly Border Patrol involved.
You know who the bad guys are, right? Anyone in opposition to our beloved president. Now, well, may you ask, 40, what does alliance theory have to say about the replication crisis? Right? It's not a sudden discovery that many social findings are false. It is a structural shift in alliance incentives that govern what kind of claims get produced, rewarded, and protected. So think about what the old academic alliance rewarded, right? The dominant academic coalition in the social sciences for decades was built around prestige journals, grant agencies, elite departments, peer networks, media amplification, right? And you would get status inside this alliance from novelty, the cleverness of your theories, and policy relevance. And the result was counterintuitive, morally resonant, politically useful, media friendly. And that conferred far more alliance value than truth, right? A result that was merely robust. Now, replication produced no alliance prestige. It did not create new theories. It didn't advance careers quickly. It didn't generate headlines, and it didn't signal creativity or moral leadership. So the incentive structure in the social sciences selected for interesting, innovative, story-driven, ideologically congenial findings, not for slow, confirmatory, boring accuracy and truth. So this is what happens when a community's status economy is decoupled from truth. The group still talks in the language of truth and epistemic rigor, but what determines success is who your allies are, which narratives your work supports, how well your results fit the coalition's moral and political self-image, whether your findings can be used as ammunition in broader cultural and political conflicts. Now, suddenly, the lack of replication became a crisis in the social sciences. So you had a new sub-alliance forming and growing in power. Methodologists, statisticians, open science advocates, younger scholars locked out of elite status networks, researchers outside the old prestige networks. They had a different enemy map. Their enemy was not reactionary politics or backward social attitudes, but questionable research practices, p-hacking, publication bias, careerist storytelling, ideological filtering. So this group gained tools, pre-registration, large-scale replication projects, open data, and they publicly demonstrated that many high-status findings collapsed under scrutiny. Now, how did the old elite respond? Minimizing, moral reframing. They attacked the replicators' motives. They claimed that context matters or truth is complex. Right? Eventually, they had to acknowledge widespread failure, but this delegitimized the very status hierarchy that had elevated them. So what looks like an epistemic dispute is also an alliance political struggle. So you have one coalition, the old elite, optimizing for narrative power, moral signaling, policy influence, media resonance, internal status reproduction. The crowd that's rising, the new subgroup, wanted to optimize for truth, procedural rigor, transparency, error detection, methodological humility, cross-camp credibility. These are different loyalty tests. So why did false results, non-replicable studies flourish in the first place? Because they were useful. They supported progressive moral narratives, institutional agendas, grant priorities, journal brands, public intellectual reputations. So you had an old elite that defined itself as advancing social justice and enlightenment. Any result that flatters that self-conception is protected. Skeptical results threaten not just theories, but alliances, careers, and moral identity. So the system drifted toward overclaiming. Underpowered bogus studies, flexible analysis, story first, method second publication. So what does the replication crisis marks? A partial realignment of the alliance structure governing knowledge. The old prestige and narrative coalition has been challenged and somewhat overthrown by a procedural and credibility coalition. Spite is not about statistics, it's about who gets to define truth and science, who gets status, who gets funding, and which moral and political narratives get protected. So the replication crisis is not just a methodological failure. It is a visible crack in an alliance system that had come to reward being interesting, useful, and morally aligned more than being reliably correct. Okay, fellow patriots, it's the Ingram Angle.
Shooting. Border czar Tom Homan is on his way there. My angle on that in moments. But first, we have a Fox News alert. A deadly and historic winter storm is leaving behind life-threatening power outages, dangerous snow and ice still across the country. Here with more is Fox weather meteorologist Ari Sarsalari. Ari, what can you tell us?
Well, what it's going to do. All right, we keep it real.
2 days after that tragic shooting during an ICE operation in Minneapolis, President Trump, Governor Tim Walz, spoke. And the man the White House called experienced, tough, and fair, as I mentioned a few moments ago, Borders Czar Tom Homan, he's now on the ground there to help solve this mess. That's more good news.
The most peaceful way to carry out this vital public safety mission is for Republicans and Democrats to do it together, and for state and local law enforcement to work together with federal law enforcement. 7 of the top 10 safest cities in the United States cooperate with ICE, and we've seen historic turnaround in safety in cities that have chosen to cooperate with ICE, that are not just led by Republicans, but also look right here in Washington, D.C.
Of course, cooperation should have always been.
So, my fellow patriots, well, may you ask, 40, Niall Ferguson, he once seemed like a serious scholar. What the hell happened in the 2000s? He became a pundit, and now he feels completely free just to seek out interesting things to say, and it's so much easier to be interesting if you are not optimizing for truth. So, how do you explain Niall Ferguson's shift? And what would alliance theory have to say? So, alliance theory wouldn't say it was a personal moral decline, it wasn't intellectual liberation, it was a change in the alliance niche that he decided to occupy. So early academic Niall Ferguson was an elite status signaler. He operated inside the academic establishment alliance. He went to top universities like Harvard. He submitted himself to peer review. He believed in archival rigor, in slow reputational accumulation. He believed in the norms of the history discipline. So the truth that he pursued was not just epistemic, it was a loyalty marker. He signaled allegiance to the scholarly coalition elite through his caution, his qualification, his methodological humility, his respect for gatekeepers, his deference to consensus procedures, right? And this ruling coalition rewarded accuracy, and it punished narrative force and boundary clarity. Now, political and media alliance structures changed, a new niche opened up, the elite to mass translator and provocation engine. He became a pundit entrepreneur, and he leapt at these rewards of attention, distinctiveness, speed, moral clarity, enemy naming, story coherence. So Niall Ferguson found that interesting beats true. Interesting beats true in talk radio and in being a pundit, because what is being optimized is not epistemic accuracy, but coalition mobilization and brand differentiation. So Niall Ferguson simply migrated from one alliance to another. So his cognitive style shifted to match the new loyalty signals. Niall didn't operate with conscious cynicism. He adapted. His trajectory looks like this. He moved from a coalition where status is derived from methodological restraint and error equals career death, to a new coalition where status equals narrative power, and error is fine if it serves the identity and positioning of a favored group. So in the pundit economy, being wrong in an interesting way is far more valuable than being right in a boring way. Because if you're interesting, right, and you strengthen your in-group identity, you clarify enemies, you provide emotionally usable stories, you differentiate the brand. Truth is a luxury good in this economy. In a high-conflict alliance system, useful beats truth every single time. Not optimizing for truth frees you up to say the most wondrous and interesting things. Right? His mind started optimizing for what's exciting, what resonates, what polarizes, what travels, what flatters the in-group, what humiliates the out-group. He's not a fraud in the simple sense. He's simply a trans academic. He's a role switcher. He moved from scholar in an epistemic alliance to a narrative entrepreneur in a political alliance. So the new governing norm in his new alliance is not, is this true, is this accurate, but does this strengthen my position in the alliance network? Does it increase my centrality, reach, and indispensability? So Niall didn't abandon truth, he simply downgraded it from master value to just one option among many, because the coalition he now serves rewards something else much more than it rewards truth. My fellow patriots, Laura Ingram.
A given. But only after 2 people were shot and killed, and only after 2 different hotels were besieged by crazed rioters did Walz decide it was time to help restore sanity to the Twin Cities. Now, after the call, President Trump said they were on a, quote, similar wavelength, and Governor Walz called the conversation productive. So why was that so hard? Now, when Biden and Obama carried out immigration arrests, there were no massive, angry protests in Minnesota or, frankly, anywhere. Millions were deported by Obama, and no one blinked an eye. Enforcement was permitted and even celebrated by the press. CNN even filmed ride-alongs with ICE back in 2016.
Under the cloak of darkness in Chicago.
Tack one, guys.
An immigration and customs enforcement team gears up for another long day.
Copy.
Pursuing undocumented immigrants who have been convicted of crimes in the U.S.
We got 3 targets this morning.
That's exactly what's happening here. The people have outstanding orders of deportation. Overwhelmingly, they do. The individuals they're trying to pick up in the Twin Cities and across the country. So the double standard by Democrats and their press poodles is glaring and telling.
So what explains the Daily Stormer's just absolute wall of silence about Laura Ingram's contributions to our national discourse? Inquiring minds want to know. Now, well, may you ask, 40, does alliance theory provide any insights into how the National Review stays relevant in the age of Trump? So the National Review was once the elite coordination organ of the old Conservative Alliance, but it lost its base, and now it's struggling to stay relevant in a coalition that is built around populism. So in its original role, National Review defined the conservative in-group, it policed the out-group, and it provided elite moral and intellectual legitimacy for governing Republican coalitions. So William F. Buckley built, and the National Review coordinated, a coalition that used business and donor elites, anti-communist security institutions, religious trads, free market intellects, and respectable middle-class Republicans. And the National Review supplied transitivity. It told all these factions who their shared enemies were and why they belonged together. The enemies were communism, the New Left, secular moral decay, and liberal statism. Right, this made the Conservative coalition coherent and governable. Then you had the rise of MAGA and populism. So populism reclassified key institutions that the National Review had always treated as allies or as neutral arbiters, such as the FBI and intelligence agencies, federal courts, elite universities, prestige media, global trade institutions, corporate America. So for the populists, these are hostile outgroups. For National Review, they are part of the legitimate order that conservatism was meant to steward, not to overthrow. So there's a transitivity collapse. National Review and the populist base no longer shared the same ally-enemy map. So the elite coordination organ was seen as disloyal, out of touch, even traitorous. Its moral language began to sound like rationalizations for an alliance the base no longer inhabits. So the National Review's never Trump posture was not just ideological, it was alliance loyalty. Its writers were socially, professionally, and historically embedded in think tanks, courts, foreign policy establishments, donor networks, prestige journalism, Atlanticist institutions. Those were their allies. And Trump and MAGA attacks these institutions, and National Review experiences it as an attack on its own alliance network. National Review's rhetoric shifted to the importance of norms, institutions, character, the Constitution, liberal democracy, the rule of law. Right, this is classic late-stage elite alliance language. They lost the mass audience, they lost mass loyalty, and so the elites have to sacralize procedure and legitimacy. Now, why is National Review still around? It coordinates a sub-alliance inside the right that includes donors, lawyers, judges, policy professionals, foreign policy hawks, and upper middle-class conservatives who fear populists. So the National Review is now the house journal of a narrow, high-status, institution-anchored conservative bloc. It cannot lead populism. Populist coalitions reward boundary hardeners, enemy namers, status warriors, charismatic loyalty, focal points. NR's comparative advantages, doctrinal coherence, institutional memory, elite respectability, rule system maintenance. Now, these traits are all liabilities in a mass populist revolt. So the National Review cannot be the voice of MAGA without ceasing to be National Review. So what is National Review's long-term role? Not mass mobilization, not coalition leadership, but elite stabilization and eventual post-populist re-coordination. If populism fails and Republicans seek a new respectable governing philosophy, something like National Review might become relevant again. Meanwhile, Fox tries to ride the populist tiger without being eaten. National Review refuses to write it, instead guards the old citadel.
No doubt been selective outrage by the liberal biased media and picking and choosing victims and highlighting their stories. President Trump does not want any Americans to lose their lives in the streets of America and in American communities across the country. He believes what happened on Saturday is a tragedy, but every life is equal to President Trump, and that's why the lives of Laken Riley and Jocelyn Nungray continue to matter to him and be an utmost priority to him to this very day. And it's unfortunate that we did not see the same.
So the National Review once was primarily written by academics, and then in the 1990s, under Rich Lowry, its writers are mainly glib pundits. So what the heck happened? So National Review, when it started in the 1950s and 60s, its main problem was elite legitimacy. The Conservative Alliance was trying to enter and displace a ruling class that was academic, bureaucratic, and intellectual. So its rivals were university-based liberalism, technocratic Keynesianism, Cold War policy elites on the left, and high culture arbiters. So the coalition needed professors, needed people who could fight on the terrain of political philosophy, history, economics, theology, and high-status intellectual debate. So the National Review functioned as an elite credentialing factory, wanted to prove that conservatism could meet liberalism on its own prestige academic ground. So the pages were full of all these highbrow intellects and serious scholars. So when a coalition tries to gain entry into high-status institutions, it has to recruit high-status signalers. By the 1990s, this alliance structure had changed. Conservatism was no longer an outsider elite faction. It had captured the presidency multiple times, it had taken over think tanks, it populated the judiciary, it had built out donor networks, it created its own media ecosystem, it no longer sought intellectual legitimacy, it was mass coordination and emotional loyalty in a post-Cold War culture war environment. So the rival set shifted. It was no longer Marxist professors, the enemy was Hollywood, television, advertising, pop culture, late-night comedy, cable news, lifestyle journalism. So in this changed environment, professors became bad alliance tools. They speak too slowly, too cautiously, too abstractly. Right? They signal elite distance, not tribal intimacy. So the National Review's coordination needs change from theory building to identity signaling, from legitimation to mobilization, from bridging to establishment, from boundary policing against cultural elites. So a coalition moves from elite contestation to mass identity conflict, and its communication shifts from scholars to performers. Pundits are better at friend-enemy dramatization, moral outrage, narrative compression, status signaling, daily repetition, emotional synchronization. So pundits create a common knowledge of who's with us and who's against us far more efficiently than academics do. So the National Review transformed from a professor's journal to a pundit magazine, as the National Review changed from an alliance legitimator to an alliance cheerleader and boundary enforcer. National Review no longer needed to prove it was intellectually respectable. It needed to keep its mass base emotionally aligned in an accelerating media war, so the talent profile changed accordingly. So 1950s, 1960s, 1970s, National Review focused on elite bridge building. From the 1990s on, it wanted to become an in-group signal amplifier. So you could look at it as a decline in seriousness, but what really happened was a change in its coalition function.
Type of sensationalist media coverage over the tragic deaths.
All these deaths, and I'm glad President Trump said that. Any death on the street is something he never wants to see, not by drug addiction, not by firearms, not accidental. He doesn't want to see anyone dead. Okay? All of these deaths, the ones that Caroline just rattled off, all those individuals, they turn out to be collateral damage to the open borders mafia, who blow their whistles and shriek inanities about how Trump is Hitler. Now, on camera, you hear them prattle on about how they're protecting their neighbors. But they don't bat an eye when their neighbors' daughters are raped by an illegal or run over by an illegal with, his second DWI. So the hardcore communists who give the octane to these mobs have one overriding goal. We have to keep this in mind with all the other noise we're hearing. Their goal is to destabilize America by frustrating a key pillar of the Trump agenda. And of course, that's border enforcement. Now, no doubt the White House, they see this very clearly. They know what's going on. So the president, smartly, is committed to a thorough, unbiased investigation. That's good. And it's going to include not just the shooting itself, but what led up to the shooting. What occurred was calculated,
Well, may you ask, 40, how does alliance theory explain Fox News and its trajectory? So Fox News is not a media company that shifted right and shifted populist. It's an alliance organ that has evolved as the Republican coalition has evolved. Right? It survives by continually renegotiating its position inside a volatile populist alliance system. So Fox emerged in the 1990s when the conservative coalition lacked a mass market narrative coordinator. The old alliance was business elites, Cold War hawks, Christian evangelicals, suburban Republicans, talk radio audiences. They shared enemies, but they lacked a unifying cultural signaler. Fox solved that by becoming the central coordination node. It supplied common maps of the enemy, shared moral language, daily identity reinforcement, elite mass bridging. So Fox created transitivity. If you watched Fox, you knew who we were and who they were. Fox synchronized donors, voters, churches, and politicians into a single cognitive and emotional coalition. Populism became a shock to that alliance. So Trump revealed that Fox was no longer the primary focal point of the right-wing alliance. We have a new super alliance formed around working class status resentment, cultural humiliation, institutional distrust, nationalist identity, internet native outrage cycles. So the primary enemies were not just liberals, but the entire old elite layer, including parts of the Republican establishment and even Fox News itself. So when a mass faction becomes more emotionally fused and more distrustful of institutions, it will bypass its own former elite coordinators. And that's what happened. Trump's direct communication, social media influencers, YouTube and podcast ecosystems, Telegram and alt media networks bypassed Fox. So Fox sits in an awkward structural position and must remain legible to regulators, attractive to advertisers, plausible to courts, acceptable to cable distributors, connected to political elites, but at the same time must retain emotional credibility with a populist base that despises institutions, must police boundary language, it must offer conspiracy, rival, exciting narratives, and a sense that we are the resistance. So Fox is trying to be both an establishment bridge and an insurgent identity organ. So Fox oscillates. When it leans institutional, it loses trust with the base. When it leans populist, it risks lawsuits, advertiser boycotts, and elite defection. So it cycles. It flirts with populist rage. It pulls back to protect legal and economic allies. It re-signals loyalty to the base. Then it re-signals responsibility to institutions. Right? This is not incoherence. It is coalition management under stress. So Fox's revenue depends on being the primary identity reinforcement channel for a large, emotionally mobilized in-group. Populism increases emotional intensity, but it decreases loyalty to any single coordinator. So the more radical, the more populist, the more distrustful the Republican base becomes, the more it fragments across platforms and personalities. So Fox tries to platform populist figures without surrendering editorial control. Fox tries to adopt populist language while keeping corporate structure. Fox tries to outsource radicalism to personalities while preserving the brand. Fox tries to signal, we are with you without becoming you. This is alliance hedging. So there are three possible future trajectories for Fox News. It becomes a successful, stable translator between the populist base and institutional power, much as talk radio was, keeps market dominance and moderates its tone. It's possible that the populist base will defect from Fox, or it can keep a mass audience but lose agenda-setting power, becomes just one alliance node among many rather than the central coordinator. So Fox is no longer the architect of the Republican coalition. It is a service provider to that coalition, desperately trying to remain indispensable while the coalition itself has become more suspicious of any central authority, including that of Fox News.
With them, that is, if we form an alliance, we oppose our allies' enemies, and we support our allies' friends. That's transitivity. Interdependence. This is probably the broadest and most underexplored one, but I think it's perhaps one of the most important ones. This is just generally whether a person or individual benefits you or not, whether they are acting in your self-interest or not. You could think of this in terms of someone acting against your self-interest. Say if you're competing with someone for status or resources, then you would be negatively interdependent with them and you would not want to form an alliance with them because it is in your interests to lower their status or to lower their access to resources so that you can get more of those resources for yourself. So that would be a kind of negative interdependence. A positive interdependence would be these people are inclined to help you, to share information with you, to trade with you, et cetera, et cetera. So interdependence are just, a cooperative relationship wherein parties benefit each other either directly or indirectly. That is likely to lead to alliances. So those are the three criteria I discuss in the paper.
So what about national conservatism? What does alliance theory have to say about the rise of Yoram, Hazony, and national conservatism? So it's not so much a new ideology, it is a new attempt to reorganize and stabilize a fractured right-wing alliance by giving it a coherent enemy map, moral language, and elite coordination. So the problem that Yoram Hazony is solving is alliance drift. So after the Cold War, the old conservative super alliance was free markets, religious trads, nationalists, US global leadership, and constitutionalists. Right? This coalition lost transitivity. This coalition's elites embraced globalization and cultural liberalism. The base experienced status loss, cultural displacement, institutional hostility. They lost their jobs. They no longer shared the same enemies. Populists saw universities, NGOs, media, transnational institutions as hostile. Establishment conservatives treated these institutions as neutral or as allies. So Yoram Hazony redrew the ally-enemy map. So national conservatism comes along and says, our allies are nations, nationalists, families, churches, armies, inherited cultures. Our enemies are the globalists, the transnational bureaucracies, these universalist moral regimes, these cosmopolitan elites, the human rights industrial complex, managerial liberalism. So this is not philosophy first, this is alliance structure first. It is a way to tell diverse factions, hey, we're all on the same side and these are the enemies. So what coalition is Yoram Hazony trying to fuse together? Religious trads, populists, nationalists, post-liberal intellectuals, security hawks, anti-woke parents, sovereignty-minded statesmen, and business elites hostile to ESG and global governance. These groups share grievances, but they lack a common language and coordinating center. Yoram Hazony supplies that. He puts on conferences. He develops manifestos. He publishes books. These are all alliance coordination classics. He creates a common knowledge of who we are and what we're fighting. So nation is the focal point. Coalitions need a high salience identity marker that cuts across class, is emotionally loaded, has historical depth, and incentivizes and organizes self-sacrifice. And the nation does that better than free markets and constitutions. Commitment to nationalism allows religious and secular conservatives to share a loyalty object without theological agreement. The nation becomes the superordinate alliance anchor. Liberalism is reframed as the enemy, not out of abstract philosophy, but because liberal institutions now sit in the rival alliance. They dominate the courts, universities, media, NGOs, international law, corporate governance norms. So Yoram Hazony critiques imperial liberalism as a way of telling his coalition, these institutions are not neutral. They are the enemy's power base. So once everyone agrees on the enemy, all the different parts of your alliance, you have transitivity. Internal differences between your alliance members become secondary. So once enemy maps align, you develop transnational alliances. You have national conservatives in America, Israel, Hungary, Poland, Italy. They all see the same enemy. It's the EU technocracy. It's the global courts. It's progressive NGOs. It's cultural universalism and globalism and the human rights industrial complex. Right? The nations differ, but their enemy set is shared. So we have cross-border elite coordination and at the same time preaching national sovereignty. So national conservatism will continue to rise if populist masses continue to distrust liberal institutions, if religious nationalist groups remain aligned, if security crises keep sovereignty salient and cultural conflict stays intense. National conservatism will fracture if economic elites reabsorb and dominate the right, if religious and secular nationalists split apart over law and lifestyle, or if a new external enemy forces liberal and conservative elites back into a shared super alliance. So Yoram Hazony is trying to do what Bill Buckley did in the Cold War, trying to define a governing coalition by clarifying its friends, its enemies, and its moral story. He's not primarily trying to win arguments, he's trying to make a fragmented right capable of acting as a unified civilizational bloc.
And of course, when we have
allies commit transgressions, we bring purpose. Generally, good, well-meaning, emphasize their good intentions. They didn't transgression. against the person they wronged. Well, one way you want to do that is you want to downplay that transgression. You want to minimize it. You want to justify it. You want to rationalize it. You want to emphasize the mitigating circumstances. You want to emphasize their good intentions. They didn't really mean to do anything wrong. You want to frame them as generally a good, well-meaning person, and the victim as being a crybaby or even making it up altogether. So that's what I would call perpetrator biases. They are extremely common, both when we commit transgressions and when our allies commit transgressions. We bring perpetrator biases to bear on that. The other side of this, of course, is victim biases. Victims have basically the opposite set of biases. So they will view the perpetrator as incredibly personally responsible for committing the harm, no mitigating circumstances, no good intentions. They were just pure evil, twirling their mustaches, and they just wanted to harm us just out of pure sadism. Of course, the harm they committed was incredibly grievous. It will last for generations. We should never forget it. We should always remember this horrible harm that will last forever. Those are victim.
All right, so that's David Pinsof speaking about the alliance theory of politics. Now, what about the charge of fascism in American politics? I noticed today the Atlantic's distinguished writer Jonathan Rauch says the Trump administration is fascist. So fascism in reality doesn't seem to have much truth value in describing American politics. So fascism is less a precise diagnosis. It's much more of an alliance labeling weapon. So people organize primarily by creating coalitions of allies and enemies, not on the basis of abstract doctrines. So this type of intense moral language is used to signal loyalty to one's own side and to humiliate the enemy. So when you call an opponent a fascist, that serves three functions for your alliance. Right, you say that we are moral and they are immoral. You enforce boundaries. Right, you signal that any cooperation, compromise, or sympathy with the enemy is betrayal. So you harden in-group boundaries and you discourage defection. You raise the cost of cross-coalition bridging. And all groups opposed to fascism are now excited and placed in the same camp. You've got transitivity, right? If A group is anti-fascist and B group is anti-fascist, then A and B are allies, even if they disagree on many policies. So you have the coordination of broad coalitions against a common enemy. So calling Trump fascist is less about truth and technical comparisons to Mussolini and Hitler. It's more about classifying MAGA and the Trump coalition as authoritarian, illegitimate, bad, horrible, outside the democratic moral order, and a threat, a harmful group, right? A disaster for existing institutional alliances. So you try to mobilize and unify groups whose primary shared feature is opposition to fascism and to MAGA, even if your coalition differs internally on economics, culture, and policy.
Biases. You could think of it as the exact opposite of perpetrator biases. And then there's another class of interesting biases that relate to conflicts over status and resources. This presumably would also be a recurrent source of conflict in ancestral environments. And the way we resolve these conflicts is by making attributions about the causes of disadvantages and advantages. That is, if we attribute a person's advantages to their internal dispositions, that is their intelligence, their talent, their wisdom, their creativity, their work ethic, then we're inclined to side with that person and let them have their advantages or their resources. But if a person lost a lot of resources or status through no fault of their own, through misfortune, through bad luck, or through mistreatment or exploitation by others, then we're inclined to side with them and we're inclined to give resources to them and compensate them.
So how do we explain the never Trump principled constitutional conservatives, right? Towering intellects like Jonah Goldberg and William Kristol and the writers for the Bulwark. So this cohort are not primarily defenders of abstract norms. They're members of a collapsing alliance network who choose to remain loyal to an old coalition even after its mass base defected. So in the old coalition, you had neocon foreign policy elites, you had free market globalists, you had constitutional originalists, you had Cold War hawks, you had donor class Republicans, you had the prestige media and the think tank world, and your enemies were the communists, the Soviets, the third world authoritarians, domestic new left radicalism and Islamism, and rogue states. So you had a hierarchical, elite-driven, institutionally embedded conservative coalition, and its moral language was constitutionalism, democracy promotion, free markets, rule-based order. Right? People like Jonah Goldberg and Bill Kristol, they weren't just intellectuals, they were alliance legitimizers. Their job was to provide the moral and intellectual grammar that made this elite coalition feel righteous and coherent. Then Trump comes along. Doesn't just change policies, he redefines the enemy. So suddenly, for Republicans, the primary enemies become the permanent bureaucracy, intelligence agencies, globalists, global trade institutions, corporate media, universities, transnational NGOs, and the old Republican donor class. So the mass base reclassified these conservative core institutional allies as enemies. So this created a transitivity crisis. Jonah Goldberg and Bill Kristol faced a choice. They could reassign allies and they could update their moral language, or they could remain loyal to their existing alliance and reinterpret the populist base as the new enemy. They chose the second, and they intensified their commitment to moral principles. So when an alliance loses power, loses dominance, its moral vocabulary must become more abstract, legalistic, universalist, and moralistic. This is a classic coalition defense move. When you can't win on numbers or emotional loyalty, you elevate procedural norms and legitimacy rules. You turn our side into the Constitution, liberal democracy, the founders, norms, the rule of law. Right? This isn't lying about caring about the Constitution. It's using the Constitution as a coalition-preserving signal. So who are you defending? Foreign policy establishment, the intelligence community, the judiciary, the prestige press, the donor class, the Atlanticist world order, the post-Cold War elite settlement. These were allies for decades. Then Trump and MAGA come along and directly attack them. So the loyalty by people like Jonah Goldberg, William Kristol to these long-standing allies is cognitively and morally prior to any ideological consistency. So the Goldbergs and Kristols reframe the conflict. It's not elite versus populist. It was about constitutionalism versus authoritarianism. The problem wasn't institutional decay. It was norm erosion. You don't have an alliance shift in the Republican Party. We have a moral emergency. So they found they were better off aligning with liberals. The old Republican coalition had lost its base, so transitivity logic kicked in. Their enemies' enemies became their friends. So progressive elites, media, security agencies, globalist Democrats now shared a rival, Trump and the populist right. So never-Trump conservatives found themselves in a new bridging alliance, even while insisting they had not changed sides. So when alliances shift, actors insist values stayed constant and only one side went crazy. So their long-term role will never be to lead a mass coalition again. Their natural habitat is elite magazines, think tanks, university centers, bipartisan democracy, defense NGOs, and transatlantic policy networks. They will remain morally confident and culturally influential within these elite institutions and structurally disconnected from the mass right-wing base. So they're not traitors, they're not heroes, they are loyalists to a fallen alliance order. They're choosing institutional continuity over populist transitivity. Their principles are real, but their alliance commitments are even deeper and more powerful than their constitutional principled conservatism.
Help them in whatever way we can. So naturally, if there's a conflict over resources or status, then we're going to want to attribute our high status allies advantages to their internal dispositions. They're smart and hardworking, and our low status allies disadvantages to external factors. They were just unlucky, or they were preyed upon by exploitative people. And so we have both of these biases, and we employ them depending on whether our allies are in the advantaged position or the disadvantaged position, and we do that in a strategic way. Those are attributional biases.
Okay, this has been real exciting, mate. I'll talk to you